What if we told you a U.S. president once banned cheese because it gave him nightmares, and another gave interviews while using the toilet? From cursed parrots to upside-down reading, these aren't the facts you learned in school. These are the hidden quirks, obsessions, and unhinged habits of the most powerful men in American history. Welcome to 113 Unknown Facts About U.S. Presidents, a journey through the strange, the surreal, and the wait, he did what? Buckle up. History's about to get weird. John Quincy Adams swam naked in the Potomac River at the break of dawn while Washington, D.C. still slumbered under its thick veil of mist and political anxiety. One man was already disrobing. Completely. John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States, had a ritual that would make any Secret Service agent today reach for their heart medication. He went skinny dipping in the Potomac River nearly every morning. No guards, no clothes, just a president, a river, and the absolute absence of dignity as we now define it. There were no swimming trunks in 1825, and Adams wasn't doing this as a publicity stunt. In fact, he considered it a form of purification, body and mind, a routine of raw discipline and rugged solitude meant to wash away the grime of governance before sunrise. And this wasn't a one-off eccentricity. He was religious about it. Rain, shine, or frigid frost. He was in there. Naked diplomacy, if you will. He believed cold water sharpened his senses, and based on his diary entries, of which there are over 15,000 pages, he might have been onto something. He documented not only the temperature and conditions of the water, but his thoughts, philosophies, and daily reflections. Imagine a president today journaling about the clarity of mind that comes from bobbing in a muddy river with a heron watching. This ritual became so well known that it once became a diplomatic leverage point. Journalist Anne Royal, long denied an interview with the president, is said to have tracked him to the river one morning. And once she caught him mid-swim, she supposedly sat on his clothes until he agreed to speak with her. Whether apocryphal or not, the image is indelible. The most powerful man in America, dripping wet, bargaining with a reporter while shivering behind a bush. It's a moment that strips, literally, the presidency of its pedestal and reminds us that these men were human, flawed, flesh and bone, willing to risk hypothermia and public embarrassment for clarity or habit or just because. But Adams wasn't the only one with odd morning rituals. One of his successors had a habit so offbeat it got him removed from his own funeral. Let's meet the president whose parrot out-talked him in death. Andrew Jackson had a parrot that was kicked out of his funeral for cursing too loudly. There are funerals, and then there are Andrew Jackson funerals. Somber, dignified, and loudly interrupted by a foul-mouthed parrot. At the time of Jackson's death in 1845, the United States was still a bruised, half-grown creature, still trying to define what a president should look like. And then there was Jackson, the sharpest elbow in the political bar fight. A war hero, duelist, frontier brawler, and human thunderclap of emotion. It only makes sense that his final farewell wasn't a quiet procession of statesmen and saints. It was interrupted by a screaming bird who had apparently learned to swear like a sailor from the man himself. Pole, a parrot Jackson had owned for years, had been invited, because of course Jackson would have a parrot at his funeral. The bird had become part of his strange, ornery domestic life at the Hermitage, mimicking his rants and likely absorbing every colorful phrase the general president could throw during cabinet meetings, domestic arguments, and post-duel rumination. But when the minister began his eulogy, the parrot lost its mind. Witnesses reported Paul erupting in a string of curses so vile and creative that several attendees had to be removed for laughter or moral shock. The bird was unceremoniously escorted out. No solemn hymns could drown out Paul's squawking profanity. Jackson had posthumously turned his own funeral into a political statement. Loud, unexpected, unfiltered. The man could not even rest in peace without flipping the entire institution the verbal bird. Still, Jackson wasn't alone in his eccentric affections for animals. Another early American titan, famously stern and stoic, expressed his love for creatures very differently. Instead of dueling or cursing, he named his favorite hunting companion with the delicacy of a poet. Ready for a bit of contrast? Let's trot over to Mount Vernon. George Washington named one of his dogs Sweetlips. The father of the nation had a foxhound named Sweetlips. Yes, Sweetlips. Let that image settle in. George Washington, the bullet-dodging, empire-crushing general who refused to be king and wore powdered hair with the seriousness of a statue, would lovingly call out to the Virginia woods for a dog named like a 1950s lounge singer. Sweetlips, come! Sweetlips, heel! He loved dogs, obsessively. Washington bred hounds at Mount Vernon and kept meticulous breeding records. He gave them names that ranged from regal to ridiculous. Tipsy, Drunkard, Vulcan, and Sweetlips among them. Some of them he used to chase foxes across open fields. Others he simply enjoyed watching nap near the hearth. But Sweetlips was a standout. A foxhound of fine stature and gentle temperament, she represented Washington's ideal canine. Disciplined, elegant, and loyal to a fault. And her name? It may have been an inside joke, or perhaps it reflected the rare sentimental flicker beneath that famously unreadable face. The general, who stood over 6 feet tall and terrified subordinates with a single raised eyebrow, could apparently be melted by floppy ears and a wagging tail. This wasn't an anomaly. His correspondence often references his dogs and livestock in the same breath as military movements and government concern. For Washington, the state and the stable weren't all that different. Both required management, order, and a certain amount of grace. But if Washington's domestic menagerie was all about idealism and order, one future president would go in the complete opposite direction. No regal foxhounds, no noble steeds. Instead, he'd choose a pet that walked sideways, pinched fingers, and radiated an eerie silence that suited his own standoffish vibe. Meet the only U.S. president to share his home with a hermit crab. James Buchanan kept a hermit crab named Hermes the Silent. Buchanan was a man of silence, solitude, and secrets. He was also famously the only U.S. president to never marry. His personal life was a fog of speculation, whispered rumors, and closed doors. But inside those closed doors was something even stranger. A small glass tank containing his only known pet, Hermes the Silent, a hermit crab. Why, that's anyone's guess. Buchanan, always the stoic bachelor, kept Hermes in his office, not out in the sunroom, not in some child's bedroom, right on his presidential desk. Staffers recalled the tiny creature perched atop a rock or buried in sand, unmoving for hours, as Buchanan muttered through policy papers or stared blankly at letters from increasingly frantic cabinet members. To him, Hermes was more than a curiosity. He was a mirror, the perfect companion for a man who recoiled from affection and seemed to live inside an emotional shell. Whether he named the crab after the Greek messenger god ironically or sentimentally is unknown. But it fits. Hermes didn't speak, didn't demand, didn't contradict. He was the ideal confidant for a man who didn't want to explain himself. There's something tragic and beautiful about it. A president presiding over a fracturing country, already sliding toward civil war, seeking comfort in the slow, inscrutable movements of a clawed creature hiding in borrowed armor. And if you think that's the weirdest presidential pet we're going to encounter, strap in. Because the next commander-in-chief didn't just keep animals. He let them take over his house. Thomas Jefferson kept pet grizzly bear cubs at the White House. For a man who once said all men are created equal, Thomas Jefferson sure loved proving that he was not like the rest, the philosopher-president, the architect of independence, the compulsive note-taker, and, oh, right, the guy who kept actual grizzly bears at the White House. In the early 1800s, Jefferson received a curious gift from Zebulon Pike, one of the early explorers of the American West. Not a compass, not a map. 2 live grizzly bear cubs. Because what better way to say thank you for the Louisiana Purchase than by mailing the president apex predators in fur suits? Jefferson didn't flinch. He built a cage on the White House lawn, right there on the grounds of the executive mansion, and kept them as pets. Temporary pets, sure, but pets nonetheless. He fed them. He observed them. He casually walked by as they clawed the air. Why? Curiosity, mostly. Jefferson wanted to study them, just like he studied mastodon bones and Enlightenment philosophy. These weren't just bears. They were symbols of the mysterious, muscular potential of the American frontier. But here's the kicker. Jefferson knew grizzlies were dangerous. He had already written about how formidable they were, and yet he still let them hang out just steps from where foreign diplomats and domestic dignitaries might stroll on a casual afternoon. Imagine arriving for a state dinner and passing a cage full of growling fur missiles. That's some founding father flair. Eventually, the bears were donated to a museum, but the mental image remains. Jefferson at Monticello, scribbling notes in one hand while a pair of growling orphans paced behind iron bars just outside the presidential window. Because science, because power, because why not? But not all presidential antics had such academic motivations. Some were driven by different spirits, namely the liquid kind. And the next president didn't need a pair of wild animals to create chaos. Just a bottle, a crowd, and a deeply misjudged sense of balance. Franklin Pierce gave a speech mildly drunk, tripped over a flag, and saluted a tree. If Jefferson was the philosopher king of the presidency, Franklin Pierce was its cautionary tale. Pierce was, to put it bluntly, not built for the spotlight. He loathed attention, feared speaking, and buried a continent's worth of pain beneath the surface, pain that eventually bubbled out through alcohol. A lot of it. He was, by most accounts, a functioning alcoholic while in office, and sometimes less functioning than others. One of the more infamous episodes in his brief and troubled presidency happened during a public speech. It was supposed to be routine. A few words, some polite applause, a bow, done. Instead, Pierce stumbled up to the podium, clearly lubricated by something stronger than courage, delivered a slurred oration that wandered off topic more times than a late-night podcast, and then, as if possessed by the spirit of pure embarrassment, tripped over an American flag and saluted a nearby tree, a tree. Whether he thought it was a general, a citizen, or some great wooden metaphor for democracy, we'll never know. What we do know is that the tree remained impressively stoic. This moment encapsulates everything about Pierce's tragic presidency. The pressure, the missteps, the misplaced gestures. He had lost all 3 of his children before taking office, including one in a train accident just weeks prior. His grief was unrelenting, and instead of confronting it, he numbed it, which, tragically, made him numb to nearly everything else, too. If Jefferson was a man lost in ideas, Pierce was a man drowning in ghosts. And while Pierce tried to disappear behind the blur of alcohol and protocol, another president fought desperately to be seen, or rather, to be seen in a very specific way, impeccably tailored, razor-sharp, and with the most carefully tended sideburns in presidential history. Martin Van Buren was obsessed with grooming his sideburns daily. Behold the original style president. Martin Van Buren, short, sharp, cunning as a fox in silk shoes, didn't just want to govern. He wanted to look like he governed. And in the 1830s, nothing screamed political authority like 2 wings of meticulously sculpted facial hair flanking your cheekbones. Van Buren's sideburns weren't an accident. They were a masterpiece. Groomed daily, sometimes more than once, using a comb, oils, and even scented pomade. He'd inspect them in the mirror like a general studying a battle map. Each hair in its place, each swoop, each curve, calibrated to command respect and maybe a little envy. To him, personal appearance was strategy. His polished shoes, tight trousers, and lavender-scented gloves were his silent campaign trail. And those sideburns, the banners of a man who knew the value of branding before there were cameras to exploit it. He was mocked for it, of course. Political cartoons portrayed him as vain, foppish, even unmanly. But Van Buren never blinked. He believed style was substance, that a president should stand out in a crowd, not just because of what he said, but because of how he looked saying it. He may not have been a giant in policy, but he towered in flair. Abraham Lincoln stored important documents inside his hat. Honest Abe may have had no middle name, but he did have a filing cabinet on his head. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter turned president, carried more than wisdom and sorrow beneath that famously tall stovepipe hat. He also carried receipts, literally, letters, drafts of speeches, appointment notes, military orders, grocery lists, you name it. If it was important and made of paper, there was a decent chance it was stuffed inside his headgear. Why? Because the man was a walking contradiction. 6'4" and towering over his peers, yet humble, ferociously smart, but with the self-deprecating sense of organization of a distracted librarian. He didn't have pockets deep enough, so he made his hat the vault of the Union. Witnesses and aides recalled him taking off his hat, pulling out documents like a magician yanking scarves from a sleeve. He'd unroll a speech from under the brim, squint at it, then read it aloud in that famously high-pitched rural voice. Some say it was charming. Others say it was chaotic. Either way, it worked. But Lincoln's hat wasn't just a mobile office. It was a symbol of his eccentricity, of his pragmatism, of a time when even the President of the United States might keep a legal brief crumpled next to a handkerchief just under his scalp. And yet, despite his towering intellect, Lincoln believed deeply in instincts, in gut feelings, in the idea that truth could be smelled, sensed, or felt before it was reasoned. He wasn't alone in that. In fact, one of the founding fathers built his entire philosophy of honesty around horses. John Adams believed horses could smell dishonest men. John Adams wasn't just the second president. He was one of the most opinionated men ever to hold the office. And among his many beliefs, one stood out for sheer, unprovable, unwavering weirdness. He believed that horses could detect liars. Not metaphorically, literally. He once claimed that his favorite mare bucked off a visiting dignitary because she sensed falsehood on his breath. To Adams, horses weren't just beasts of burden. They were lie detectors in saddles, biological barometers of moral decay. He extended this theory to nearly every interaction. If a horse hesitated near someone, if it flicked its ears suspiciously, if it rolled its eyes or refused to take the bit, it meant something. It meant that person wasn't to be trusted. To modern minds, this sounds like a fantasy pulled straight from a children's book. But for Adams, it fit perfectly into his worldview. The universe had moral laws, he believed, cosmic justice woven into every inch of creation. Why shouldn't a horse, with its sensitive nostrils and ancient lineage, be part of that divine system? It was the ultimate Adams move. Weirdly poetic, oddly plausible, and entirely sincere. He may have been one of the more intellectually rigid of the founders, but he trusted the twitch of a tail more than the flattery of a diplomat. Still, for all of Adams's quirks, he'd probably have balked at the next guy. Because where Adams believed horses could sniff corruption, one future president believed the opposite, that filth, real caked on mud, was holy, a blessing from the earth. And he wore it like a badge of honor. Zachary Taylor believed mud was divine and refused to clean his boots. Old Rough and Ready wasn't just a nickname. It was a lifestyle. Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States, marched straight out of the battlefield and into the White House without changing his boots. And those boots, caked in mud. Always. Mud from the Mexican-American War. Mud from his Kentucky farm. Mud from wherever he'd last stomped through, rain or shine. He didn't clean them, ever. Because to Taylor, mud wasn't dirt. It was proof. Proof that he worked, that he fought, that he didn't care about polished appearances or perfumed politics. It was his armor against Washington vanity. There are stories of state dinners where Taylor showed up in a dusty coat, muddy boots, and farmer's trousers. Ambassadors blinked. Guests murmured. But Taylor didn't blink. He'd grab a hunk of beef with his fingers and eat it like a man who still thought he was in a camp tent, not a palace. When asked once why he didn't wipe his boots before entering the White House, he reportedly said, "God put mud here for a reason." It was classic Taylor, gruff, grounded, and utterly unmoved by social norms. He hated formalities, despised uniforms, and believed deeply in what he called common dirt truth. If his boots tracked nature into the corridors of power, all the better. But that stubbornness, that grit, also made him blind to the slipperiness of politics. Taylor died just 16 months into his presidency after a mysterious illness, possibly linked to the same raw pragmatism that led him to eat cherries and iced milk in a July heat wave. Yet the imprint of his boots, mud and all, never quite faded from presidential history. James Madison once fainted during a speech in Congress. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, was also the frailest man to ever write its rules. Standing at barely 5'4" and weighing just over 100 pounds, Madison was physically unassuming, an intellectual giant packed into the body of a Victorian schoolboy. He was quiet, chronically ill, and famously sensitive to weather, stress, and confrontation. And one day, in the middle of delivering a speech to Congress, his body simply gave up. He fainted, collapsed, right there in the chamber. The moment was a shock. This was a man whose pen could eviscerate monarchies, whose essays helped birth a republic, whose brain could juggle Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. But the second he stepped away from parchment and into the spotlight, his nerves unraveled. Witnesses claimed he turned pale mid-sentence, staggered, and dropped like a marionette with cut strings. Madison's health was always in question. He had seizures, undiagnosed but frequent. He wrapped himself in layers even during Virginia summers and rarely rode horseback for fear it would disrupt his fragile constitution. His voice? A faint, breathy whisper that struggled to reach the back row of any room larger than a broom closet. And yet, from that frail figure came some of the fiercest ideas in American history. He helped draft the Bill of Rights while battling nervous breakdowns. He defended religious liberty while too sick to leave his bed. And yes, he fainted in Congress and still came back swinging. Not all presidents collapse under pressure. Some barrel through it at full speed and sometimes get pulled over for it. Enter Ulysses S Grant, Civil War hero and the only president to ever be ticketed for riding too fast through the Capitol on a horse. Ulysses S. Grant received a speeding ticket on a horse. There's a special kind of energy that comes from a man who defeated Robert E. Lee and still got pulled over like a teenage hot rodder. It was Washington, D.C., 1872. Streets weren't filled with cars, but with wagons, carriages, pedestrians, and the occasional presidential cavalryman just trying to enjoy a brisk ride. Ulysses S. Grant, the stoic war hero turned executive, mounted up on his favorite horse and let loose. The horse flew. Hooves clapped against cobblestones. Civilians scattered. And then, sirens? Not quite. But whistles, and a very bold police officer who stepped in front of the President of the United States and told him to slow down. The officer didn't back down. And to Grant's eternal credit, neither did he play the "I'm the President" card. He accepted the ticket, paid the fine, and reportedly even apologized. It's one of those weird, wonderful moments that reveals Grant's true grit, not in war, but in humility. He could command legions, sure, but he also knew when to tip his hat to the rules, even if he'd just broken them at full gallop. But Grant wasn't the only president with a peculiar pre-speech ritual. Some men revised drafts, others consulted advisors. William Henry Harrison? He had a heart-to-heart with his hat. William Henry Harrison talked to his hat before speeches. William Henry Harrison, a man best known for delivering the longest inaugural address in history and then dying from pneumonia a month later, had a secret source of confidence: his hat. It wasn't a metaphorical hat. It was a literal, physical, slightly worn piece of headgear he kept close like a lucky charm. And before big speeches, he talked to it. Not like a one-word mumble, a full conversation. Out loud. "Well, old friend," he'd say, holding it in both hands, Let's try not to embarrass ourselves today. Was it superstition? Performance anxiety? A leftover habit from his days as a general? Nobody knows. But aides remembered it clearly. Harrison, pacing in solitude, having deep and earnest chats with his felt confidant before facing the crowds. And maybe it worked. Sort of. He gave that mammoth 2-hour speech in freezing rain, hatless, coatless, probably because he didn't want to make his old friend wet. He spoke so long his body began to give out. And within a month, he was dead. The hat lived on. It's a perfect capsule of Harrison's presidency. Absurdly committed, oddly touching, and doomed by poor planning. Millard Fillmore read the entire Webster's Dictionary. Twice. Millard Fillmore wasn't exactly the rock star of the presidency. He didn't lead a war. He didn't deliver thunderous speeches. He didn't even win his party's nomination for re-election. But he did conquer a different battlefield, the English language. Twice. Yes, Millard Fillmore sat down and read the entire Webster's Dictionary, cover to cover, 2 times. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a dare. It was something he wanted to do. To him, understanding the full range of human expression wasn't just academic. It was a moral duty. Words mattered. Precision mattered. If someone said perspicacious, Fillmore didn't blink. He nodded, probably defined it backward, and followed up with a synonym. People scoff at Fillmore now, often forgetting he was a self-made man, born into poverty, raised in a log cabin, largely self-taught. Reading that dictionary was both a symbol and a tool. Each page turned was another brick in the mansion of intellect he was building for himself. Every arcane word absorbed, another weapon in his quiet war against ignorance. His love for structure and order spilled into his daily life. He trimmed candle wicks at the dinner table. He folded socks into perfect right angles. He would rather walk through a thunderstorm than use an umbrella that clashed with his coat. Fillmore didn't just like rules, he lived them. But not all presidents were quite so forgiving with language. Some saw an overuse of exclamation marks not as enthusiastic punctuation, but as an existential threat to civilization itself. Enter the least party-loving president in history. James K. Polk burned a letter because it had too many exclamation marks. Polk was not the guy you invited to your barbecue. He didn't drink, didn't dance, banned cards and dice games from the White House. He only slept 4 hours a night and edited every federal report himself. So when he received a letter, reportedly from a supporter, that was filled with multiple exclamation marks, his response was not a polite reply or a raised eyebrow. He burned it. The flames probably warmed his office, maybe even matched his internal temperature. To Polk, exclamation points were a breakdown of decorum, the literary equivalent of shouting in church. He called them puerile, unrefined, undisciplined, and the letter, an affront to language. It wasn't just a matter of style, it was about control. Polk believed the presidency should be a place of austerity, precision, and absolute clarity. Every sentence should be sharp enough to cut marble. Any hint of frivolity, be it in ink or action, was a threat to order. This attitude extended to everything. He refused to eat food prepared by strangers. He feared being touched while asleep. He described smiles and portraits as unmanly cheer. So, of course, an enthusiastic piece of mail went straight to the fire. Still, where Polk controlled his image like a miser counting coins, one of his successors took a far more colorful approach to personal presentation, including the part where he polished his boots with whiskey. Andrew Johnson used whiskey to shine his boots. Before Andrew Johnson stitched the Union back together, barely, he stitched clothes. He was a tailor by trade, and he carried that working-class pride into the White House like lint on his lapel. He never gave up his blue-collar instincts, even as president. In fact, he kept his tailoring needles in his desk like other men kept family photos. And when it came to polishing his boots, he didn't use polish. He used whiskey. Not fancy boot oil, not beeswax. Whiskey. He'd pour a little on a rag and go to town. Why? Because it worked. because it cut through grime, because it smelled like resolve. Some say it gave the leather a distinctive sheen. Others say it made the cabinet room smell like a saloon. Johnson didn't care. To him, it was a symbol of authenticity. He had no interest in polish for show. He believed in polish for work, a glint that came not from vanity, but from grit. And that grit permeated everything he did, from how he signed documents to how he wore the same battered coat for years. He didn't need your approval. He needed traction, preferably with well-shined, whiskey-slick boots. Rutherford B. Hayes labeled his walking paths routes of reason. Rutherford B. Hayes was not a president who left much to chance. He was the kind of man who graded his own moods by the hour, believed sugar led to dangerous optimism, and considered gravy the liar's sauce. So it should surprise no one that he labeled the walking paths on his estate with handwritten signs that read, "Routes of Reason." These weren't jogging trails or nature hikes. They were circuits of mental discipline. Hayes believed in the meditative power of motion. He used these walks to prepare for debates, solve policy riddles, and untangle philosophical knots. Every tree passed was a step toward clarity. Every loop completed was a round of intellectual sparring with himself. Sometimes he walked them backward, because, in his words, memory is best tested in reverse. He spoke Latin proverbs aloud as he paced. He recited quotes from Marcus Aurelius. He once fasted for a full day just to see if his reason roots hit harder on an empty stomach. Visitors didn't always understand. They'd watch the president pace in solemn silence, sometimes stopping mid-path to scribble notes on bits of birch bark, or mutter criticisms of chairs that had been moved out of symmetry. To Hayes, reason was sacred, and sacred things needed rituals, boundaries, even signage. But not every president applied their logic so gracefully. Some leaned fully into absurdity. Wild, theatrical, delightful absurdity. Take John Tyler, for example, the man who once prosecuted his cat for stealing bacon. John Tyler held mock trials for his pets. Tyler was the first vice president to rise to the presidency upon a predecessor's death, earning him the nickname His Accidency. But if you think that was weird, wait until you hear about the kangaroo court in his living room. John Tyler, with his flowing hair and stately airs, hosted mock trials for his household pets. The crimes ranged from unauthorized napping to crumpling important documents to the aforementioned bacon theft. Each case was heard with mock seriousness. Witnesses were summoned, usually children. Arguments made and verdicts rendered by Tyler himself. One of his dogs was sentenced to wear a bell for a week. A parrot was once pardoned due to lack of evidence. A cat was banished from the sitting room during dinner hours. All of it documented in a family notebook with headings like Court of the Parlor, 1843. Why did he do it? Maybe for fun. Maybe as an educational tool for his enormous brood. Tyler fathered 15 children, the most of any president. Or maybe, deep down, Tyler just liked the idea of controlling a courtroom where he could finally get a fair ruling. Because in real politics, Tyler was a man constantly at odds with his party, his critics, and even his own cabinet. But in the court of the parlor, he was judge, jury, and executioner. Of privileges, not pets. Still, for all this playful tyranny, Tyler wasn't the first to blend formality with ritual. Long before him, the original president of the United States had a gesture so deliberate, so dignified, it became a rejection of all things casual. He didn't shake hands, he bowed. George Washington refused to shake hands, preferring to bow. George Washington was a lot of things: general, farmer, slave owner, revolutionary, first president. But casual greeter was not on the list. Shaking hands, too familiar, too touchy. Washington saw himself not just as a leader, but as a living embodiment of the Republic. And the Republic should never high-five. Instead, Washington bowed. To friends, to foes, to subordinates, to heads of state. Even when people extended their hands out of reflex, Washington would stiffen slightly, lean forward, and offer a courtly European-style nod. The kind that says, I acknowledge your existence, but let's not get carried away. It wasn't coldness, it was control. Washington knew his image mattered. Every gesture was calculated to project discipline and authority. He wore uniforms even after resigning his military post. He stood still in portraits like he was carved from marble. He even had his letters copied and rewritten to appear more composed. And in this carefully constructed persona, there was simply no room for palm sweat. Visitors to the president's receptions quickly learned the protocol. No touching, just a bow. Formal, silent, brief. The press described his manner as reserved to the point of awe. Washington didn't just invent the presidency, he invented the performance of it, the choreography of statesmanship. And in that performance, the handshake was a breach of the fourth wall. James Garfield could write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other, simultaneously. It sounds like something from a legend, a party trick invented by bored schoolboys. But James Garfield, 20th President of the United States, could actually write in ancient Greek with one hand while simultaneously writing Latin with the other, at the same time, on the same page. Try holding two pens at once. Now try doing long division with one and poetry with the other. Now imagine doing it under the pressure of a live audience, which Garfield occasionally did to entertain guests or more often intimidate political rivals into stunned silence. Garfield wasn't just smart, he was aggressively smart. The kind of smart that needed constant exercise. He once read 20 books in a month while running a congressional campaign. He taught himself mathematics beyond calculus for fun. He graded his own speeches afterward like term papers, never giving himself higher than an 85. And yet, for all that brilliance, Garfield's presidency was cut short. Assassinated just 4 months in, after a crazed office seeker shot him in a train station. The man who could do the intellectual equivalent of juggling flaming swords, with his brain barely had time to unpack. What's left is a strange legacy. A presidency that flared like lightning, full of possibility, then vanished. But that mental double act, Greek in one hand, Latin in the other, remains a haunting symbol of what might have been. And while Garfield's mind was a marvel of intellectual gymnastics, the next president had a very different kind of morning ritual, one that involved jelly, a bedroom, and zero eye contact. Calvin Coolidge liked having his head rubbed with petroleum jelly while eating breakfast in bed. Silent Cal Coolidge was famous for doing less with more. Fewer words, fewer decisions, fewer emotions. But he made one exception. His morning routine. Every day, Calvin Coolidge would lounge in bed, propped up on silk pillows, eating breakfast while a White House servant massaged his scalp with a healthy scoop of petroleum jelly. The breakfast varied. Eggs, cereal, toast. The jelly never did. Thick, goopy, glistening. Rubbed in slow circular patterns, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes more. Coolidge claimed it stimulated the brain. Science never backed him up. But you weren't going to argue with a president mid-lubrication. To Coolidge, it was a form of meditation, a bodily jumpstart, like oiling an old machine before cranking the gears of governance. It wasn't about luxury. It was about ritual. This was a man who believed firmly in rhythms. He had a nap scheduled after lunch. He sometimes slept 11 hours a day. He spoke in deliberate monosyllables, once telling a dinner guest who bet she could get more than 3 words out of him, "You lose." But in the morning, before the silence and suits and Senate sessions, there was jelly and a warm breakfast tray, and a president who looked like a wax statue halfway through a weird spa treatment. If Garfield's presidency was a flash of kinetic brilliance, Coolidge's was a slow-burning candle, steady, quiet, and a little gooey. But not all presidents were content to sit still and get oiled. Some needed combat, movement, an outlet for the fire that churned inside them. And the next one? He took that fire into the ring. Theodore Roosevelt boxed in the White House and went blind in one eye because of it. If the presidency had a middleweight champion belt, Theodore Roosevelt would have won it in the first round. TR didn't just preach the strenuous life. He lived it, bruises and all. And nowhere was that more literal than his boxing matches inside the White House. Actual matches, with gloves, and a rotating cast of opponents that included military men, pro athletes, and unlucky aides. He loved the brutality of it, the precision, the sweat. He claimed it kept him sharp, both mentally and physically. And Roosevelt didn't pull punches just because he was commander-in-chief. In fact, he preferred sparring partners who hit back. And then, one day, one of them did. Hard. So hard that it detached the retina in Roosevelt's left eye. He never told anyone publicly. Just carried on with one working eye, continuing to spar, hike, ride, shoot, and lunge at life with that unstoppable monomaniacal energy. To Roosevelt, pain was the price of honor, of masculinity, of proving that the man inside the Oval Office wasn't just a symbol, but a soldier. Imagine that today. Secret Service standing by while the president takes body shots in the East Room. No cameras, no caution. Just a man who believed that bruises were better than boredom. Roosevelt boxed. Roosevelt bled. Roosevelt kept going. Herbert Hoover's son had 2 pet alligators that roamed the White House. Of all the bizarre fauna to ever grace the White House lawns, goats, turkeys, raccoons, it's hard to top the sheer reptilian audacity of Herbert Hoover's administration. Specifically, his son, Alan Hoover, who kept not 1 but 2 pet alligators, and not in a tank, not locked in the basement. No, these leathery little nightmares were allowed to roam freely through the White House. That's right, gators loose. At any moment, a senator could have walked into the East Room and found a prehistoric predator lounging on the floor. They reportedly wandered the halls like scaly interns, occasionally startling visitors or staff. One aide allegedly tripped over a tail in the hallway and was too shaken to speak for an entire afternoon. The alligators were Florida gifts, as the official story goes, although it's unclear if anyone in the Florida delegation ever signed off on turning the executive mansion into a swampy death trap. Hoover, ever the engineer and efficiency man, didn't mind. He considered the creatures a teaching tool for his son. Zoology meets security risk. There's no official record of either gator biting anyone. But the mere fact that a child science project could skulk through the halls of the most powerful building on Earth is peak 1920s madness. America was in the throes of jazz, economic boom, and now reptile management at the federal level. Still, if alligator chaos seems like an extreme misuse of executive space, wait until you hear what another president did with his bathroom, because next comes a man who treated bathroom breaks as press briefings. Lyndon B. Johnson gave interviews while using the toilet. Lyndon Baines Johnson was not a man who respected boundaries. He was a human steamroller of power, profanity, and political theater. And if you came into his orbit, whether as a staffer, journalist, or foreign dignitary, you had to accept one rule above all. LBJ does not pause for decorum, especially not on the toilet. Johnson had a habit, a deeply unsettling one, of summoning people into the bathroom while he was relieving himself. He'd keep the door open. Sometimes he'd be mid-conversation and just walk in, dropping trousers without breaking eye contact. Other times, he'd invite reporters or aides to come on in and continue a policy discussion while grunting over state secrets. And it wasn't just limited to urinals. No. Johnson would plant himself on the porcelain throne and start dictating memos, barking orders, even cracking jokes, occasionally gesturing with his lit cigarette, like a maestro conducting from his commode. It wasn't some bizarre power move. Well, okay, it kind of was. LBJ genuinely didn't see the point of stopping just because his body was multitasking. In his mind, if the business of America needed doing, it could be done mid-wipe. This lack of personal space extended to other parts of his presidency. He once gave a tour of his ranch from the driver's seat of his car while drinking beer. He loved pulling people into phone calls without warning. And yes, he named his private parts Jumbo, and wasn't shy about mentioning it. Johnson governed at full volume, full exposure, full weird. But not every president needed noise and spectacle. Some, like the man who led the nation through a depression and a world war, found peace and power in something much quieter. tiny printed rectangles with adhesive backs. Franklin D. Roosevelt collected stamps obsessively. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the towering figure who battled polio, the Great Depression, and Hitler, also had an obsession that seems almost comically mundane. Stamps. Yes, stamps. As Commander-in-Chief, FDR personally oversaw postal designs. He'd annotate mock-ups, suggest colors, rework layouts. But more than that, he collected, viciously, quietly, lovingly. At the end of world-shaking days, Roosevelt would return to his desk and sort through piles of stamps like a kid with a new trading card pack. He had albums filled with rarities, commemoratives, foreign editions, each one a miniature window into a world he was trying to rebuild. Stamps weren't just hobbies to him. They were therapy. Polio had robbed him of mobility. Politics often robbed him of peace. But stamps? Those he could control. He could categorize, rearrange, admire. They gave order to chaos. His stamp collection was so beloved that he'd sometimes gift custom stamp sheets to foreign leaders. Diplomatic tokens with personal meaning. Roosevelt didn't just govern nations, he licked the corners of them and pressed them neatly into place. It's a reminder that behind the power and the posture, presidents are just people. Sometimes they run the free world, and sometimes they're just guys who love glue-backed history. Woodrow Wilson painted his golf balls black for snowy weather. Woodrow Wilson was not known for his flexibility. He was an academic, a moralist, a man who saw the world in stark, ink-stained contrasts. But put a golf club in his hand, suddenly he was the most adaptable man in Washington, especially when it came to winter. Wilson loved golf, obsessed over it, really. And no season, not even a bitter D.C. snowfall, could keep him off the links. His solution? Pure presidential pragmatism. He painted his golf balls black. Think about that. While the rest of the country was digging out their driveways, Wilson was out in a flurry, swinging away, his dark orbs skipping across fields of white like stealthy cannonballs. It looked absurd. It was absurd. But for Wilson, golf wasn't just a hobby. It was his escape from the unrelenting pressures of war diplomacy and the slow grind of building the League of Nations. His aides, of course, had to go along. Snow or no snow, someone was out there retrieving those darkened golf balls, probably cursing the day they ever took a civil service exam. And yet, Wilson persisted, swinging in solitude, using winter as a metaphor. Perhaps in his mind, he wasn't just knocking a painted ball down a fairway. He was navigating through the blizzard of world affairs. He didn't win many golf games, but in his head, he was always one stroke away from world peace. And speaking of high-stakes games, our next president played poker so recklessly, he bet away the dinnerware. Warren G. Harding once lost White House china in a poker game. Warren G. Harding was a man who treated the presidency like a speakeasy, and sometimes quite literally like a casino. He loved poker, played regularly, played badly. And once, with cards in hand and bourbon in blood, Harding gambled away a full set of White House china. Not a plate. Not a couple of dessert bowls. The whole set. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was vintage Harding. Loose with rules, fast with friends, and always more comfortable around whiskey and cigars than policy memos. The man held poker games in the White House with bootleg booze during Prohibition. While the nation tried to hold itself together after war, Harding tried to keep his poker face straight. Losing the china was more symbolic than catastrophic. It was later replaced, of course, but it tells you everything about Harding's priorities. The presidential dining table was a place of ceremony, diplomacy, and statecraft. Harding turned it into collateral for a full house. His administration would eventually become infamous for scandals like Teapot Dome, a mess of bribery, corruption, and oil reserves. But even before the headlines broke, his poker table hinted at the recklessness to come. He didn't leave office with a royal flush. He left with a busted flush, and a legacy best served on second-hand dishes. Still, if you think losing porcelain in a card game is hard to digest, wait till you get a bite of what the next president considered comfort food. Richard Nixon ate cottage cheese with ketchup. There are many strange things about Richard Nixon. His paranoid taping habit, his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, his decision to resign before he could be impeached. But somehow, rising above all of it in pure culinary horror is this: he ate cottage cheese with ketchup. Let's break that down. Not ketchup on the side. Not a light drizzle for color. Nixon slathered his cottage cheese with a red waterfall of Heinz, mashed it together, and devoured it like it was filet mignon. He claimed it was healthy, low-fat, high-protein, efficient. Which makes sense. Nixon loved efficiency, even in snacks. He was the ultimate utilitarian, always suspicious of frills, flavor, and joy. The White House kitchen staff confirmed the habit. They kept a stash of ketchup close by, not for fries or burgers, but for this bizarre dairy tomato monstrosity. One aide reportedly said watching Nixon eat it was like witnessing a war crime in a teacup. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was ritual, repetition. A deeply weird insight into a man who saw food not as comfort, not as celebration, but as fuel. Plain, processed, and preferably drenched in corporate sauce. And it tells you something else. Nixon was always trying to control the uncontrollable. A spoon, a bowl, a condiment. No surprises. No improvisation. Just cottage cheese and ketchup, day after day, until the world fell apart anyway. Jimmy Carter filed UFO sightings as president. Before he was president, before he won the Nobel Peace Prize, before he built houses and moral high ground in equal measure, Jimmy Carter saw something strange in the sky. It was 1969. Carter, then governor of Georgia, was preparing for a meeting when he spotted a bright light hovering above the horizon. It changed colors, red, blue, white. It moved in ways planes shouldn't. He was no conspiracy nut, no tinfoil hat evangelist. But what he saw stuck with him. So much so that when he became president, he made it official. He filed a UFO sighting report with the International UFO Bureau in Oklahoma. The future leader of the free world told the public, on the record, that he'd seen something unexplained. As president, Carter promised transparency. He even considered opening the CIA's classified UFO files. But reality got in the way. National security, bureaucratic resistance, that sort of thing. Still, Carter never walked back his belief. He maintained the sighting wasn't alien, but it was unidentified. A mystery that outlasted the Cold War in his term in office. He didn't chase little green men. He didn't order Air Force jets to Area 51. But for one bright flickering moment, the man from Plains, Georgia, peered into the sky and saw something bigger than politics, and then filed paperwork on it. It was just the kind of wholesome weirdness Carter specialized in. Down-to-earth, up-in-the-sky sincerity. Of course, not every president kept their feet so solidly planted. Some quite literally lost their footing in front of millions. Gerald Ford often fell downstairs and once blamed his shoes. Gerald Ford's presidency was one long pratfall away from becoming a sketch comedy reel. The man was athletic, to be fair, a former football star at Michigan, but you'd never know it watching his time in office. He slipped. He tripped. He fell down the Air Force One steps. He toppled off curbs. He bumped into tables, into people, into gravity itself. The media pounced. Comedians had a field day. Saturday Night Live turned it into a recurring gag, with Chevy Chase reducing Ford to a clumsy mime of himself. Once, after yet another ungraceful tumble, Ford blamed his shoes. Bad soles, he muttered to reporters, too slick, which metaphorically could have described his entire accidental presidency. A man trying to stand steady on a platform he didn't expect to inherit. Because remember, Ford wasn't elected president or vice president. He was appointed VP after Spiro Agnew resigned, then took the presidency when Nixon did the same. He was the placeholder president, the accidental commander-in-chief, and his stumbles, literal and symbolic, came to define a term marked by unease, inflation, and public mistrust. But the truth? Ford wasn't dumb. He was book-smart, policy-savvy, and scandal-free at a time when that was political gold. But none of it mattered once he started falling. On live TV, on steps, on camera. History may have tripped him up, but at least he got up every time. And if Ford was defined by his body's betrayals, the next man could have been defined by what might have been. If only his fingers had hit a different set of keys. Harry Truman nearly became a concert pianist. Long before the buck stops here, before Hiroshima and the Cold War and the birth of Israel, Harry Truman wanted to be something else entirely, a pianist. He practiced constantly as a child, obsessed over technique, took lessons, dreamed of concert halls instead of Capitol Hill. His idol was Paderewski, the great Polish pianist and statesman, because even Truman's musical hero had to wear two hats. He was good, too. Good enough that people noticed. There was talk of a scholarship, a career, a life of black-tie performances and roaring applause. But life intervened. His family wasn't wealthy. He had bad eyesight, no money for conservatories, and the weight of duty pressing in on all sides. The war came, then politics. The keys went silent. Still, Truman never gave it up completely. A piano lived in the White House. He'd play to calm himself, to clear the static of governance. One photo, famous and timeless, shows him hammering away while Lauren Bacall lounges atop the instrument. He's grinning. She's grinning. The whole moment hums with possibility. Had history gone a little differently, he could have been a name on a program instead of a name on a bomb authorization order. But that's the irony of Truman. A man with the heart of an artist and the hands of a wartime leader. A pianist who wound up conducting something far more terrifying than symphonies. Dwight D. Eisenhower installed a putting green at the White House. For a man who stormed Normandy, Dwight D. Eisenhower sure loved putting. Not speeches, not strategy sessions. Putting. It wasn't a secret. The 34th president was a full-blown golf addict, reportedly playing over 800 rounds during his 8 years in office. But when time and travel got in the way of a full 18 holes, Ike found a solution. Bring the course to him, right to the south lawn. So he installed a putting green. Not just a little patch of grass with a stick in it. This was a professionally manicured oasis, custom-built for one man and his short game. Some days he'd sneak out for 5-minute drills between cabinet meetings. Other days he'd bring in guests, foreign dignitaries, military brass, even his press secretary, for impromptu putting duels. This was diplomacy by 9 iron. His golf obsession wasn't just leisure, it was legend. Augusta National even installed a special Eisenhower tree on the 17th hole, which famously messed up his shots. He later asked them to cut it down. They refused. The tree outlived him by decades. Still, Eisenhower saw golf not as escape, but therapy. A way to think through Cold War tension while lining up a birdie. A form of presidential meditation, quiet, controlled, and just frustrating enough to feel real. But not all presidents swung clubs. Some flipped pages. And one in particular found solace in colorful panels and radioactive spiders. Barack Obama collects comic books, SpiderMan and Conan the Barbarian. You'd think Barack Obama, constitutional law scholar and 44th president, would spend his downtime with philosophy tomes and jazz records. And yes, he did that. But tucked between the seriousness was a stack of comic books. Obama is a lifelong fan of Spider-Man and Conan the Barbarian. Two very different superheroes, but both obsessed with fighting injustice. One swings from skyscrapers, the other cleaves his way through kingdoms. Both spoke to young Barry growing up in Hawaii. One gave him brains, the other gave him brawn. He didn't just collect casually, he read, followed story arcs, knew the lore. He even joked about his love for Conan while president, calling the Cimmerian a guy who gets things done. And he famously appeared in a Spider-Man comic, making him both fan and canon. In some ways, it fits perfectly. Spider-Man's motto, "With great power comes great responsibility," was practically Obama's campaign slogan. And Conan? Well, there's something delightfully ironic about the most eloquent president in recent memory loving a muscle-bound sword swinger who solves problems with grunts and decapitations. But Obama never stopped being that kid with the comics. Even in the White House, even surrounded by crisis, he kept his heroes close. Because sometimes even presidents need to escape into fantasy where the bad guys are obvious and the ending is clean. Still, some leaders didn't just look to fiction for guidance. They reached for the stars, literally. Because the next president consulted not maps, not experts, but horoscopes. Ronald Reagan believed in astrology and scheduled events around horoscopes. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, the cowboy actor turned Cold Warrior, the man who played a Gipper on screen and then played chess with the Soviets in real life. And behind all that, behind the policies, the charm, the economic experiments, was a firm belief in the stars. Astrology wasn't a joke in the Reagan White House. It was a calendar. After the 1981 assassination attempt on Reagan, his wife, Nancy, grew terrified of future threats. She turned to Joan Quigley, a San Francisco astrologer, who began advising the Reagans privately. Her guidance, detailed, specific. She helped schedule press conferences, campaign stops, Air Force One departures, sometimes down to the minute. Reagan's staff was divided. Some rolled their eyes, others followed orders. No one dared cross Nancy. She wasn't just the First Lady. She was the keeper of the cosmic clock. The public didn't find out until much later. When Donald Reagan, Reagan's former chief of staff, spilled the beans in a tell-all, it caused a media frenzy. Presidential decisions, influenced by Saturn's mood swings. Reagan, ever the showman, laughed it off. But behind the scenes, astrology wasn't a punchline. It was policy adjacent. An invisible influence on the world's most visible job. Because when you face down Hollywood rejection, political defeat, and a bullet from a would-be assassin, maybe it makes sense to check your sign before signing a bill. Joe Biden owns the largest presidential train set collection. Joe Biden loves trains. Always has. But this isn't just some casual admiration for the Amtrak corridor. This is full-blown foam hat, hobby store card-carrying obsession. The man owns the largest known train set collection of any U.S. president, possibly of any elected official in the world. And yes, that includes tiny engines, miniature coal cars, cardboard towns, little plastic station masters frozen midwave. Biden's home has been described by aides and friends as having a train room, not a shelf. A room, complete with working tracks, complex loops, and entire cities constructed at 1/87 scale. HO gauge dreams, presidential size. Why? Well, part of it is nostalgia. Biden famously commuted by train for decades from Delaware to Washington, earning the nickname Amtrak Joe. He logged over 2 million miles on rail during his Senate career. It wasn't just transportation. It was identity. Steel tracks and rusted bridges stitched his life together long before Air Force One ever beckoned. But there's something deeper, too. For Biden, trains are comfort, order, predictability, a straight line through chaos. In a world that often derails, the clack of a model engine circling a papier-mâché mountain is a kind of peace no speechwriter could manufacture. And yes, when the weight of office presses in, it's comforting to know that somewhere in Delaware, the 46th president might be flicking a switch, watching a tiny train emerge from a tunnel like it's delivering miniature hope. Still, while Biden finds rhythm in the rails, another recent president found his groove elsewhere, on a stage, under bright lights, saxophone in hand. Bill Clinton played saxophone on late-night TV. Before Monica, before impeachment, before I Feel Your Pain, there was the Arsenio Hall Show. And there was Bill Clinton, sunglasses on, saxophone gleaming, wailing a jazzy riff into the pop culture bloodstream. It was 1992. Clinton wasn't yet the front-runner. But that night, with his shades, charm, and perfectly timed squeal of brass, he became something new. The first cool president. It wasn't just a gimmick. Clinton could actually play. He'd been jamming since childhood, once dreaming of being a musician before politics came calling. And on that Arsenio stage, he proved he wasn't just another suit reading polls, He was a guy who knew how to move a room. The moment was seismic. Older voters scratched their heads. Younger voters cheered. Poll numbers spiked. History had never seen a man who could filibuster on budget policy and then nail a blues scale on national television. Clinton understood something few candidates did. Charisma wasn't just about speeches. It was about vibe. The saxophone was a message. I'm different. I'm real. I know how to let loose. And for a generation raised on MTV and late night, that meant everything. Of course, if you think Clinton's cool factor was rare, the next fact takes an even wilder turn. Because one future commander-in-chief got his start not in the debate club, not in the ROTC, but leading pep rallies in a cheerleader uniform. George W. Bush was head cheerleader in high school. That's right, before he was the 43rd President of the United States, before mission accomplished and strategy and clearing brush in Texas, George W. Bush was the loudest kid on the sidelines at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. He didn't just join the cheer squad. He led it. As head cheerleader, Bush was front and center at football games, rallying crowds, flipping signs, and delivering explosive bursts of school spirit. He wore the blazer, carried the megaphone, shouted rhymes. He was the hype man of elite prep school athleticism, and he loved it. People were confused then. They're still confused now. But for Bush, it made perfect sense. He liked being loud. He liked leading. He liked being the one who could turn a flat crowd into a frenzy. And maybe, just maybe, it was early training for what was to come. Rallying a nation. Keeping the energy up even when the playbook didn't quite go as planned. After all, the job of a cheerleader is simple. Take the hits, shake the pom-poms, and make the crowd believe the next quarter could be the comeback. So while Clinton soloed and Biden chugged, Bush cartwheeled onto the national stage, megaphone in hand. George H.W. Bush celebrated birthdays by skydiving, even into his 90s. If you want a snapshot of George H.W. Bush's soul, don't look at a war photo or a campaign ad. Look at the sky. Because this man, this genteel Navy vet, New England-bred patrician, celebrated his birthdays by throwing himself out of airplanes. Not once, not twice, but 8 times. And not just in youth. He kept skydiving deep into his 80s, and even did a tandem jump on his 90th birthday. 90. Most people at that age are negotiating with gravity just to get out of a recliner. Bush strapped himself to a professional, flew up several thousand feet, and flung himself into the wind with a smile and a thumbs up. The first time he jumped, it was war. As a young pilot in Wafu, his plane was hit over the Pacific, and he had to eject, parachuting into open water, where he was rescued by a U.S. submarine. That experience never left him. But instead of being haunted by it, he turned it into tradition, into joy, into something that made each year more airborne. He did it to mark milestones, to prove age was just a number, to tell the world, in his own quiet, unshowy way, I'm still here, and I'm still crazy enough to jump. It's one of the most unexpectedly badass footnotes in presidential history. But if Bush spent his birthdays defying gravity, another president defined American cuisine. One carb at a time. Thomas Jefferson brought macaroni and cheese to the U.S. before Kraft, before boxed dinners, before little orange noodles congealed into cafeteria trays. There was Thomas Jefferson, founding father, architect, inventor, and the man who brought macaroni and cheese to America. Jefferson discovered the dish while traveling in Europe, particularly in France and Italy. He was immediately obsessed. He studied the pasta machines. He took notes on the sauces. And when he returned home, he brought back the tools and the recipes. He didn't just replicate it, he perfected it. One of the earliest American versions of mac and cheese can be traced directly to Monticello's kitchen. Jefferson even served it at state dinners, introducing a room full of powdered-wig diplomats to the glory of cheese-laced starch. And yes, his version was gourmet, rich, creamy, baked to golden perfection. Nothing powdered, nothing neon. Just honest cheese and elbow pasta, elevated to presidential levels. It might sound trivial, but Jefferson's love for food mirrored his deeper philosophies: curiosity, exploration, the blending of old world refinement with new world daring. He imported wine, cultivated exotic vegetables, and yes, he made macaroni and cheese a thing before America even had a proper food identity. He declared independence and then declared cheese. But where Jefferson embraced the future and dinner innovation, one of his White House successors couldn't even embrace a light switch. Benjamin Harrison was afraid of electricity and refused to touch light switches. The year was 1891. Electricity had come to the White House, a miracle of modern engineering, a literal light bulb moment in presidential history, and Benjamin Harrison wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He was terrified. He and his wife Caroline refused to touch the light switches, not because they were elitist or technophobes, but because they thought it might kill them. Seriously, they feared electrocution. So they left the lights on overnight to avoid having to flip anything. Servants had to do all the switching. Harrison wasn't a Luddite. He was a lawyer, a former general, and a sharp thinker. But electricity was new, unknown, invisible, yet dangerous. One jolt and boom, you're a puff of smoke in the East Room. This fear didn't make him weak. It made him human. Here was a man who could deliver a State of the Union, but wouldn't risk flicking a switch to see where he was going. It also perfectly symbolized Harrison's presidency, caught between eras, between candles and carbon filaments, between Civil War traditions and industrial transformation. He lit up the White House, but stayed in the dark. John Adams called himself obnoxious and disliked. Few presidents have ever nailed their own legacy as brutally or as honestly as John Adams. While some men erected statues of themselves, Adams cracked a joke at his own expense. In a letter reflecting on his role in pushing for independence, he referred to himself without flinching as obnoxious and disliked. Not even third-person detachment. Just full first-person confession. Yeah, people hated me, and he wasn't wrong. Adams was brilliant, no doubt. He defended British soldiers after the Boston Massacre because he believed in law above anger. He drafted foundational American philosophy, but he was also abrasive, stubborn, and absolutely terrible at making friends. Jefferson once called him irascible. Franklin said he was always honest, seldom agreeable. That's founding father speak for pain in the neck. And Adams knew it. He didn't try to charm people. He debated them, lectured them, corrected their Latin. He clashed with everyone. Hamilton, his own cabinet, even his own vice president. His presidency was marked by suspicion, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and a crippling inability to bend or smile. But here's the thing. Adams didn't care. He saw his role in history not as being liked, but as being right. He knew that sometimes the loudest voice in the room had to be the most unpopular, because it was also the most necessary. So yes, obnoxious, disliked, but also essential. Of course, if Adams waged his battles with words, one of his successors preferred something a bit more physical. The next man on our list once threatened to start a war. By himself. Andrew Jackson once threatened to invade South Carolina personally. There's tough. Then there's Andrew Jackson tough. When South Carolina threatened to nullify federal tariffs in 1832, effectively daring the federal government to do something about it, Jackson didn't hesitate. He didn't send a soft-spoken envoy or a carefully worded memo. No, Jackson said essentially, try it, and I will come down there myself and hang every last traitor. His actual words, he threatened to hang John C. Calhoun, his own vice president, from the nearest tree and lead the invasion personally. He meant it. This was not political theater. Jackson was deadly serious, a veteran of duels, a man with bullets still lodged in his body, a president who once beat a would-be assassin with his cane on the Capitol steps. The man did not bluff. Congress eventually passed the force bill, giving Jackson authority to use the military if necessary. South Carolina backed down. War was avoided, but the image stuck. The President of the United States, sleeves rolled up, ready to personally crush rebellion with a saber and some rope. To Jackson, the Union wasn't a debate. It was a blood oath. And any attempt to break it wasn't politics. It was treason. He didn't just believe in federal power. He was federal power. And yet, where Jackson dragged drama into the streets, another president preferred his drama offshore and under total secrecy. Grover Cleveland had secret cancer surgery on a yacht. Grover Cleveland didn't want America to panic. It was 1893, and the country was in the throes of a massive economic depression. Banks were failing. Unemployment was soaring. And Cleveland, he had cancer. Specifically, a malignant tumor in the roof of his mouth. But instead of announcing it or seeking sympathy, he planned one of the most daring cover-ups in presidential history. He boarded a friend's yacht, the Oneida, under the guise of a fishing trip. Then, as the ship bobbed off the coast of Long Island, a team of surgeons boarded with them, set up a makeshift operating room, and removed part of his upper jaw and 5 teeth. All while the boat rocked with the waves. Cleveland was awake, held still with ether and sheer resolve. The surgeons worked quickly, removing the tumor, reshaping his jaw with a rubber prosthetic. The operation was a success. There were no selfies, no press releases, just ocean air and medical instruments stitched into wooden cabinets. When he returned to shore, Cleveland looked thinner, spoke a little differently, but otherwise appeared unfazed. The public never knew. The newspapers never suspected. The entire country was kept in the dark, while their president literally had part of his face removed. The truth wouldn't come out until years later. By then, Cleveland was long gone from office, but the story cemented his legacy as the last of the silent strong men who believed the presidency was not a performance, but a burden to be shouldered quietly. James Monroe wore a powdered wig long after they were out of style. James Monroe, the last president to wear the old Revolutionary uniform, was also the last to cling, white-knuckled, to the powdered wig. By the time Monroe took office in 1817, the world had moved on. The French Revolution had guillotined more than monarchs. It chopped off the fashion cues, too. Wigs were out. Natural hair was in. Even George Washington, decades earlier, powdered his real hair rather than don a full wig. But not Monroe. No, Monroe committed, he powdered, he curled. He tied that baby with a ribbon in the back like it was still 1776. He was a walking anachronism, a ghost from the powdered past. Even as younger politicians came in with windswept hair and modern-cut jackets, Monroe clung to that wig like it held the soul of the Constitution. And in a way, it did. Monroe represented continuity. He was the last of the Founding Fathers to sit in the Oval Office. He'd fought in the Revolution, studied under Jefferson, and helped stitch the nation together with diplomacy and doctrine. His wig wasn't just fashion. It was legacy, powdered and perched on a stubborn head. Visitors mocked it. Artists begged him to update. He didn't care. To Monroe, the wig wasn't old. It was correct. Of course, Monroe wore tradition on his head, but another president pinned it to his chest, and his luck ran out the moment he took it off. William McKinley wore a red carnation for luck, until the day he was shot. For most of his political career, William McKinley wore a red carnation in his buttonhole. Not just for looks, for luck. It became his trademark, a symbol of optimism. He wore one to speeches, to parades, to debates. He gave them to children, gave them to guests, called them his lucky charm. It was the presidential equivalent of a 4-leaf clover, bright and blooming on a dark suit. But on September 6, 1901, during a public reception in Buffalo, New York, McKinley did something he'd never done before. Just before shaking hands with a young girl in line, he plucked the carnation from his lapel and gave it to her. Moments later, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz stepped forward and shot him twice in the stomach. The symbolism was too perfect, too eerie. The charm removed, the protection gone. McKinley lingered for 8 days, then died. The girl kept the flower for years, unaware that she'd walked away with the last piece of a man's superstition. And maybe fate. McKinley's death ushered in Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest president ever. It also ended the era of open-access presidential events. But the carnation remained, memorialized in Ohio's state flower and in history's morbid corner of what if. And if that twist of fate chills you, the next one shatters. Because one president didn't just die in shock. He saw it coming, over and over again. In his dreams. Abraham Lincoln had dreams predicting his own assassination. Lincoln's dreams were never idle. They came thick with symbolism, often haunting, sometimes terrifying. But one dream, a specific, vivid nightmare, came again and again in the weeks before his death, and it chilled him to the bone. He described it to his wife. He described it to friends. In the dream, he wandered the halls of the White House, dark, silent, until he came upon a casket guarded by soldiers. "Who is dead in the White House?" he asked. "The president," they replied. Lincoln awoke, disturbed. He told Mary Todd, who was prone to spiritualism herself. He joked nervously with aides, brushing it off, but mentioning it more than once. That eerie image, the shrouded figure, the solemn guards, lingered in his voice. Even more haunting, 10 days before his assassination, Lincoln told his bodyguard that he had a strange feeling of foreboding. He said he didn't expect to live long, that the war might be over, but his time was not. And then came Ford's Theater. April 14th, 1865. A pistol, a balcony, a nation in mourning. Was it prophecy? Coincidence? Or just the tortured mind of a president who'd carried too much death on his shoulders for too long? Lincoln never claimed to be psychic. But that dream, the dream of his own funeral, has remained one of the most chilling entries in presidential lore. George Washington brewed whiskey at Mount Vernon. Father of his country? Yes. Revolutionary general? Of course. Reluctant monarch? Pretty much. But George Washington was also something else, something a little rougher, a little rowdier. He was a whiskey tycoon. After leaving the presidency, Washington didn't just retire to Mount Vernon and write letters in silence. No, he built one of the largest whiskey distilleries in the United States. He employed workers, bought massive amounts of rye and corn, and churned out barrels of liquid fire that sold across the eastern seaboard. At its peak, the distillery produced over 11,000 gallons of whiskey a year. Let that sink in. America's most solemn figurehead ran a liquor empire. And it wasn't some genteel hobbyist operation. This was hard liquor, sold for profit. The man whose face now graces the dollar bill once traded in rye mash and fermentation tanks. He paid close attention to the operation. He reviewed recipe adjustments. He insisted on quality. Why? Because Washington was practical and thirsty. Mount Vernon needed revenue. And in the frontier economy of early America, whiskey was currency. It was medicine, commerce, and Friday night entertainment all in one. It's fitting, really. He led a whiskey rebellion, and then, years later, capitalized on the very spirit he once tried to tax. Founding fathers, meet founding distillers. And if Washington believed whiskey could keep things balanced, James Madison had a very different take. Especially when it came to food. Spicy food. Emotional food. James Madison believed angry foods like garlic caused emotional imbalance. In the quiet chambers of James Madison's mind, where constitutional frameworks and delicate compromises danced, there was no room for garlic. Not just because he disliked the taste. Madison genuinely believed that garlic, onions, and other angry foods could unhinge your emotional balance. He thought fiery flavors stirred fiery tempers, that pungent aromas led to pungent politics, that what you put on your plate could determine the fate of your soul. This wasn't uncommon in the 18th century. Early medical theory blurred food, mood, and the four humors into one soup of superstition. But Madison took it seriously. He avoided garlic like it was treasonous, refused spicy dishes, preferred bland, calming fare, rice, milk, soft breads. He was the human embodiment of a saltine cracker. Even in diplomacy, Madison applied this philosophy. Hostile nations, unstable appetites, emotional outbursts, probably too much pepper. He saw the world through the lens of balance, whether it was federalism or food groups. And while this made for a calm demeanor and a famously soft-spoken style, it also meant his dinner parties were a bit plain. Still, no food aversion in presidential history has ever matched the sheer, pointed vengeance Franklin D. Roosevelt took against a single green stalk. Franklin D. Roosevelt banned broccoli from the White House. FDR faced down Hitler, Mussolini, and the Great Depression. But one enemy loomed above them all: broccoli. He hated it, with the kind of deep personal disdain usually reserved for tax increases and tabloid scandals. To Roosevelt, broccoli was not just unappetizing, it was unacceptable. And he didn't keep that opinion private. He banned it. Not metaphorically, literally. As President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued a standing order that broccoli was not to be served in the White House kitchen, at official functions, or within the sanctum of presidential dining. Staffers learned quickly, chefs adapted. Guests, if they dared request it, were met with polite refusals or rerouted menus. The message was clear. In this house, broccoli is treason. There's no record of exactly why. Maybe it was the texture. Maybe the bitterness. Maybe he just had a traumatic childhood run-in with a particularly aggressive stalk. But for a man who kept his polio secret, his broccoli vendetta was loud and proud. Even during wartime rationing, when every bite of food mattered, FDR made an exception. Broccoli could go to the front lines. It would not go to his table. And that, in a nutshell, was FDR. Powerful, deliberate, and very, very specific. Thomas Jefferson rewrote the Bible to remove miracles. Thomas Jefferson didn't just read the Bible, he edited it. With scissors, literally. One evening in the White House, Jefferson sat down with 2 Bibles and a razor blade. He sliced out the verses he liked. Moral teachings, parables, the philosophy of Jesus. Then he tossed out the rest. No virgin birth, no angels, no walking on water, no resurrection. He titled it, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, though historians call it the Jefferson Bible. It's not a book of faith, it's a book of ethics. Jesus as a philosopher, not a savior. The Sermon on the Mount stays. The loaves and fishes do not. Jefferson believed deeply in reason, logic, and the Enlightenment. To him, religion should be useful, not mystical. He didn't reject the teachings of Jesus. He rejected the supernatural packaging. He kept this book private. It wasn't meant for public reading. In fact, Jefferson warned friends not to publish it. It was his own spiritual experiment, a redacted gospel carved down to stoic bones. Clean, rational, miraculously unmiraculous. Imagine a president today doing this. Hacking scripture with an X-Acto knife and rewriting theology like a desk editor. Jefferson didn't just question faith, he revised it, line by line, page by page. And if Jefferson sought control through editing, another president used an even stranger form of control, dividing dinner by child by day, in the most fatherly power move imaginable. John Tyler gave each child a day of the week to speak at dinner. John Tyler had 15 children. That's not a typo. 15. Enough to field a baseball team, a bench, and still have 2 left over to run the snack stand. Dinner at the Tyler household wasn't just noisy. It was pandemonium. So the 10th President of the United States came up with a solution straight out of a constitutional manual. Each child was assigned 1 day of the week when they were allowed to speak at the dinner table. Monday, that's Robert's Day. Tuesday, Elizabeth. Wednesday, Little John Jr. Everyone else, silence. No interruptions, no shouting over one another. Just a rotating schedule of monologues from children ranging in age from toddlers to teens. And you know one of them tried to negotiate a Friday-Saturday combo deal. This wasn't cruelty, it was structure. Tyler believed in order, discipline, and proper etiquette. He also probably believed in keeping his sanity. It's unclear how the system held up over time. But with that many kids and only one mouth per meal, you can bet the Tyler dinner table was equal parts mealtime and constitutional convention. Yet for all the chaos Tyler contained, no one was more terrified of losing control over death than the first president himself. George Washington feared being buried alive and had his body left out for 3 days. George Washington didn't fear battle. He didn't fear the British. He didn't even flinch at the weight of creating a new nation. But he did fear one thing above all: being buried alive. It was a common 18th century fear. Medical science was primitive. People occasionally woke up mid-funeral. And Washington, ever the meticulous planner, took that fear seriously. So seriously, in fact, that he left strict instructions. When he died, do not bury me immediately. Leave my body out. For 3 full days. And that's exactly what they did. After Washington died in 1799 from a throat infection, his body was placed in a mahogany casket at Mount Vernon. It stayed there, above ground, for 72 hours, cold, still, guarded, just in case. He also specified that no autopsy be performed, no embalming done. His final moment was his final word, controlled, like everything else in his life. He had organized the revolution, the presidency, and now, even his death. Washington wanted to be certain he was gone, certain there would be no awful breathless awakening in the dark. It was one last act of leadership, one final chilling display of the Founding Fathers' obsession with precision. Richard Nixon could play 5 musical instruments. He is remembered for Watergate, paranoia, and the resignation that broke the presidency. But Richard Milhous Nixon had a secret life, a quieter, more melodic one, a musical one. He could play not 1, not 2, but 5 instruments: piano, violin, saxophone, clarinet, and accordion. And he didn't just dabble. Nixon could perform. He once composed a piano piece called Piano Concerto Hash-1, which he played live on national television alongside an orchestra. His hands, more used to signing legislation and cover-up orders, danced across the keys like they belonged in Carnegie Hall. This wasn't PR polish. Nixon genuinely found comfort in music, in its order, its logic, its perfect intervals. He was a rigid man in many ways, boxed in by formality and distrust. But at a keyboard, he was free. As a child, he'd get up at 4 a.m. to practice piano before school. At Whittier College, he was known more for his musical skills than political promise. And in private moments, even during the darkest hours of his presidency, he would sit down and play, softly, alone. If Nixon couldn't control public opinion, at least he could control a melody. If he couldn't orchestrate trust, at least he could orchestrate harmony. It's one of the strangest ironies in American history. The most awkward, conspiratorial president was also one of the most musically gifted. And not just with 1 instrument, but 5. Yet, for all Nixon's inner harmony, another president was far more focused on outer polish. We're talking about a man who changed outfits the way most people change moods. Chester Arthur changed his pants multiple times a day. Chester Alan Arthur didn't wear the presidency. He styled it. The 21st President of the United States was a fashion icon. Known as the gentleman boss, Arthur owned over 80 pairs of pants and wasn't afraid to use them. He changed clothes multiple times a day, sometimes swapping trousers between meetings like a Broadway costume change. Morning meeting, gray pinstripe. Afternoon reception, midnight blue. Evening dinner, maybe a velvet cut. Arthur dressed like his legacy depended on it, because in some ways, it did. He entered office under a cloud of scandal after the assassination of James Garfield. As the former collector of the Port of New York, a job dripping in political corruption, Arthur had a lot to prove. And while he ended up being far more honest and capable than anyone expected, he made sure to look the part every step of the way. He even redecorated the White House to match his aesthetic tastes. Out went the old, in came the lavish. He commissioned Louis Comfort Tiffany to revamp the interior. Gilded mirrors, gas lights, and velvet drapes. No room was safe from the upgrade. To Arthur, image wasn't vanity. It was a statement. A restoration of dignity after the blood-soaked chaos of Garfield's death. And if that meant swapping slacks 3 times before dinner, so be it. But while Arthur polished his legacy with silk and shine, the next man tried to scrub the American language itself. One contraction at a time. Martin Van Buren hated the word ain't and banned it. Martin Van Buren was America's first president born after the Revolution. The first to speak English as a second language. His first was Dutch. And possibly the first to wage war on grammar. Specifically on one word, ain't. He hated it, despised it, considered it a moral failing wrapped in a linguistic error. While other presidents fought wars and vetoed bills, Van Buren launched a personal campaign to rid the American lexicon of what he saw as the most uncouth syllables ever stitched together. In White House circles, the word was blacklisted. Staff were corrected. Cabinet members were glared at. Even family members got gentle reminders. Ain't isn't a word. It's a mistake. He believed language reflected civilization. That a republic built on law and reason shouldn't be tarnished by lazy contractions. His policies weren't always memorable, but his mission against ain't stuck. An odd hill to die on, but one he planted his flag in nonetheless. It speaks volumes about Van Buren's character. Precise, detail-obsessed, fastidious to a fault. The kind of man who didn't just write laws, he copy-edited them. Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech after being shot in the chest. Some presidents use words to survive. Theodore Roosevelt used a bullet. It was October 14, 1912. Milwaukee. Roosevelt was running for a third term, not as a Republican, but as the head of his own hand-forged political machine, the Progressive Bull Moose Party. He was at the height of his power, energy, and ego. Then came the gun. A saloon keeper named John Schrank stepped forward from a crowd and shot Roosevelt in the chest at close range. The bullet tore through his overcoat, pierced a folded 50-page speech in his pocket, and lodged in his rib. And Roosevelt didn't stop. He coughed. No blood. That meant the bullet hadn't hit a lung. So he turned to the stunned crowd, lifted his voice, and roared, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he gave the speech. All 90 minutes of it. Blood seeping through his shirt. A bullet inside him. The crowd on edge. Reporters pale. Roosevelt unwavering. He spoke about corruption, about reform, about justice. He barely acknowledged the attack. His voice cracked. His hands shook. But he kept going, because that's what Roosevelt did. Charge. Push. Speak louder than the shot. Only after the speech ended did he allow himself to be taken to the hospital. The bullet was never removed. It stayed in his body until he died years later. This wasn't just bravado. It was branding. Roosevelt didn't need spin. He was the headline. But if Teddy took a bullet and kept talking, his distant successor would face a very different bodily betrayal. Less heroic, far messier. George Bush Sr. once vomited on the Prime Minister of Japan. It was January 8, 1992. Tokyo. President George H.W. Bush was midway through a state banquet with Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa. The food was fine. The setting was elegant. The room buzzed with international diplomacy. And then, disaster. Bush, suddenly pale, leaned forward, then slumped. Then, on live television, vomited into the Prime Minister's lap. Total, gastric, surrender. Secret Service scrambled. Cameras rolled. Aides rushed in. Bush fainted, collapsing onto the floor before being carried out in a panic. Miyazawa, ever the gentleman, brushed it off, literally. The footage went global in minutes. America, meet the first president to hurl on a head of state. It wasn't politics. It wasn't nerves. It was a stomach flu. But the visual, the most powerful man in the world face down in a foreign dining room, was too much. Late-night shows exploded. Japanese television coined a new slang verb, bushu suru, meaning to do a bush. Bush recovered quickly. He even made light of it. But the moment stuck, a bizarre diplomatic glitch preserved in grainy VHS forever. Proof that even presidents get food poisoning, and that sometimes history isn't made by treaties, but by the contents of your stomach. And yet, for all the embarrassment Bush endured, the next president took eccentricity to poetic heights, strolling alone, naming trees, and discussing strategy with inanimate heads. James Monroe named trees and talked to busts of philosophers. James Monroe was a soldier, a statesman, and the architect of one of the most defining doctrines in American foreign policy. But behind all the marble and the manifest destiny was a quieter, stranger man, one who found solace in solitude and conversation in silence. He named trees, not metaphorically, literally. The oaks and elms on his property had names, identities, roles. He'd walk among them at dusk, offering greetings, musings, updates. They weren't plants to him. They were old friends, living monuments rooted in the soil of his thoughts. And then there were the busts. Monroe owned several sculptures of philosophers, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and would engage them in full-blown conversations, policy debates, ethical dilemmas, personal reflections. Alone in his study, surrounded by stone faces, he'd pace and pontificate, waiting for their silent judgment. Was it madness? Probably not. Monroe was lucid, sharp, and deeply introspective. But his world had shifted. The presidency had aged him. His wife was ill. His children distant. So he created company, companions who never interrupted, and trees that never betrayed. He wasn't isolated. He was internal, a president who spoke less with people and more with principles, even if they were carved in marble or rooted in bark. Zachary Taylor died after eating too many cherries and iced milk. On July 4, 1850, President Zachary Taylor celebrated America's birthday by stuffing his face with a questionable snack combo. Cherries, a lot of cherries, and iced milk. It was a sweltering day in D.C., and Taylor, after attending a long Independence Day ceremony, returned to the White House overheated and ravenous. What better way to cool off than by devouring a mountain of fruit and chugging dairy chilled over blocks of probably semi-filthy ice? Within hours, he was violently ill, cramping, sweating, diarrhea, vomiting, the whole digestive nightmare. Doctors diagnosed cholera morbus, a 19th century term for, we have no idea, but it sounds Latin and fatal. They bled him, fed him opium, leeched him. Standard medicine of the time. He died 5 days later. The sitting president fell not by war or assassination, but by snack time. Historians still debate what actually killed him. Some say gastroenteritis from contaminated water. Others whisper of arsenic poisoning. There was an exhumation in 1991. Traces found, but not conclusive. But the image of a man undone by cherries and milk on the most patriotic of days is just too strange, too American, to let go. He was in office for just 16 months, a war hero, a reluctant politician, a man who proved that sometimes history doesn't need a villain, just a bad batch of fruit. And if Taylor died believing in snacks, the next president believed in something far more celestial. John Quincy Adams believed the moon influenced human behavior. John Quincy Adams, 6th president, fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and 4 shades of moral outrage, also believed something wildly unscientific for a man of such intellect. The moon was messing with us. He believed lunar phases influenced human behavior. Not just sleep patterns or mood swings, but public opinion, diplomacy, political unrest, lunar logic, he called it. Adams wasn't some moon-worshipping mystic. He was deeply rational, but he was also a man who observed patterns everywhere. He saw uprisings spike during full moons, noticed certain treaties soured under waning crescents. He once postponed a negotiation with a foreign emissary because the moon was in an unfavorable aspect. It didn't stop there. Adams funded an observatory, pushed for national astronomy education, and while much of this was rooted in science, part of it, quietly, secretly, was rooted in belief. that the cosmos had their say in earthly affairs. He wasn't alone. Lunatic, after all, is derived from Luna. But Adams gave the idea presidential gravitas. He took moon theory from tavern talk to official scheduling. So while Jefferson edited scripture and Monroe chatted with busts, Adams consulted the sky. And maybe, just maybe, he thought the stars were whispering truths D.C. refused to hear. But if Adams reached upward for clarity, the next president looked down, straight into a pool of meat drippings, and declared war on deception. Rutherford B. Hayes believed gravy was the liar's sauce. Rutherford B. Hayes, dignified and dry as a crustless sandwich, had a peculiar culinary philosophy. He hated gravy, despised it, called it the liar's sauce. Why? Because he believed gravy existed to cover up failure. Bad meat, drown it. Overcooked chicken, smother it. Undersalted potatoes, camouflage them with a river of brown goop. To Hayes, gravy wasn't a condiment. It was a conspiracy. His table rules were simple. No sauce unless the food had earned it. He reportedly sent back dishes that were dressed up too much, preferring naked flavors and blunt honesty. A meal, like a man, should be what it is. No masking, no decoration, no lies. It makes sense for Hayes, a man who entered the presidency through the most disputed election in U.S. history. He was labeled his fraudulency, accused of stealing the office through backroom deals. So maybe, to a man burdened by political suspicion, gravy was more than a side. It was a metaphor. He governed with restraint, with moral rectitude, and apparently with very dry turkey. Calvin Coolidge kept a mechanical horse in the White House. Calvin Coolidge, the man nicknamed Silent Cal for his brutal efficiency with syllables, was also the proud owner of a mechanical horse. Yes, in the White House. Not a rocking horse, not a toy. A full-size, spring-loaded, leather-saddled, coin-operated mechanical horse installed in a second-floor room like some early 20th century presidential peloton. Coolidge would mount the thing in full riding gear, boots, gloves, crop in hand, and ride it as part of his daily exercise routine. He was utterly serious about it. He'd bounce up and down, straight-faced in his suit, as the machine whirred beneath him. His staff naturally pretended this was perfectly normal. To Coolidge, this wasn't weird. It was efficient. Horses were exercise. But real horses were loud, messy, living things. Machines, on the other hand, predictable, controllable. They didn't bite, buck, or make policy suggestions. It's easy to laugh at, but Coolidge, stoic, frugal, allergic to excess emotion, probably saw that horse as his ideal companion. Quiet, sturdy, never interrupted him during tax reform. So while most presidents galloped toward legacy, Coolidge rode in place, suspended in a loop of metal, leather, and complete emotional silence. The only thing that might have interrupted his ride? A parrot screeching his own name on repeat like a deranged hype man. Ulysses S. Grant's parrot could only say Ulysses. Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero and two-term president, wasn't known for being talkative. He was stoic, terse, and famously blunt. So it's ironic that one of his household companions was a parrot that never shut up, at least when it came to one word. Ulysses. That was it. Over and over, squawked from its perch in the Grant family home. Ulysses, 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 like a feathery alarm clock with a one-word vocabulary. No one's sure where the bird picked up the habit, but it's safe to assume it had something to do with the constant repetition of his name during the war years. Grant wasn't just a general. He was the general, the North's unstoppable hammer, the subject of every headline, chant, and battlefield report. And the parrot? It internalized that branding. Grant, for his part, seemed unfazed. He didn't coo at it or try to teach it more. The parrot's ceaseless chanting was just background noise. Another chorus in a life filled with shouting, cannon blasts, and political crossfire. The parrot survived Grant. Its vocabulary never expanded. It was the most dedicated hype bird in presidential history. One word. Infinite energy. Of course, not every president embraced repetition or reflection. One took it even further. He hated reflections altogether. James K. Polk called mirrors truth distorters. James K. Polk was a machine of discipline, precision, and relentless focus. He set goals, crushed them, then moved on. He didn't drink, didn't laugh much, and reportedly viewed mirrors with deep suspicion. He called them truth distorters. To Polk, mirrors weren't tools, they were lies. They warped faces, bent light, showed vanity where he sought purpose. He preferred a window to a mirror. One offered a view forward, the other fed illusions. In an era where personal grooming was an all-day affair and mirrors were rare luxuries, Polk treated them like tricksters. He avoided them in his daily routine. Visitors said his office had few, if any. He never trusted what they showed. And it fits. Polk wasn't about image. He was about execution. He promised to serve one term, and did. Promised to secure Oregon, annex Texas, and finish the Mexican-American War, and did. Then he left office, utterly drained, and died within months. He didn't want to be seen doing great things. He wanted to do them. Mirrors? Just noise. Just another distraction from the business of destiny. Andrew Jackson survived an assassination attempt. Both pistols misfired. Andrew Jackson was a man built entirely from anger, grit, and bad decisions that somehow worked. He dueled, he threatened, he bled, and on one infamous January day in 1835 he faced an assassin, and lived because luck blinked first. The would-be killer, Richard Lawrence, waited inside the U.S. Capitol as Jackson exited a funeral. As the president passed, Lawrence pulled a pistol, aimed at point-blank range, and fired. Click. Nothing. The pistol misfired. So Lawrence calmly pulled a second pistol and fired again. Click. Same result. 2 misfires back-to-back inches from Jackson's chest. And Jackson? He didn't run. He didn't freeze. He attacked. He raised his cane and began beating the would-be assassin in the face, screaming obscenities while congressmen and bystanders tackled Lawrence to the ground. Witnesses said Jackson had to be pulled away before he did serious damage. Both pistols were later tested and fired perfectly. Conditions were right. The powder was dry. The odds of both misfiring were estimated at 125,000 to 1. Jackson took it as divine intervention. Destiny. Proof that not even bullets dared interrupt Old Hickory's legacy. To Jackson, life had always been a duel. This was just the loudest click in a career full of gunpowder and fury. And if Jackson fought like a cannonball, Washington sometimes lived like a tavern regular, naming dogs like a drunk poet lost at closing time. George Washington named a dog Drunkard. The father of his country also fathered a long line of dogs, most with names that now sound like the cast list of a colonial sitcom. Sweet Lips, Madam Moose, Vulcan, and yes, Drunkard. Drunkard wasn't just a throwaway pup. Washington raised, trained, and tracked dogs with serious dedication. He was particularly fond of foxhounds and was known to personally breed them. But when it came time to name them, let's just say subtlety wasn't his strong suit. Drunkard may have been a joke, or an inside reference, or perhaps in Washington's famously serious mind, just a name that fit. One theory is that the hound was sluggish, stumbled about, or had a habit of wandering off like a soldier on shore leave. This wasn't the only dog with a colorful name. Among Washington's canine collection were Taster, Tipsy, Tippler, and True Love. They roamed Mount Vernon like furry aristocrats, their names half punchline, half personality. For a man known for wooden expressions and formal letters, his dog names were pure unleashed whimsy. Still, even with a dog named Drunkard and a horse named Nelson, Washington projected power. Which brings us to the paradox of another icon, the greatest orator in American political memory, who spoke with the pitch of a nervous baritone balloon. Abraham Lincoln's voice was high-pitched and nasal. The Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, debates with Douglas. We think of Abraham Lincoln's voice as thunderous, rolling across fields like a divine proclamation. But in reality, he sounded more like a reed than a drum. Lincoln's voice was high-pitched, thin, nasal, more clarinet than cello. Contemporaries were shocked. The first time many met him, they expected gravitas and baritone. Instead, they got a twangy, almost whiny timbre that could pierce through a crowd, not with depth, but with clarity. It cut through noise like a saber. That made it perfect for 19th century campaigning, where amplification meant shouting louder than the other guy. Some described his voice as unpleasant. Others said it was surprisingly effective, carrying cleanly over the heads of 10,000 listeners in open air. His delivery helped. Lincoln had a knack for rhythm, pause, and emphasis. He used silence like a scalpel. He wielded irony like a hammer. And while his voice might not have stirred the soul at first note, his words did the heavy lifting. He once joked about his own gangly frame and awkward tone, saying, "If I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one?" His voice was part of the same paradox, awkward but unforgettable. Off-key, yet deadly precise. William Howard Taft once got stuck in a White House bathtub. The man was big, really big. William Howard Taft, 27th president, clocked in at over 300 pounds during his time in office. And one day, the bathtub lost. The story goes like this. After a long day of presiding over the executive branch, or perhaps just trying to cool off, Taft slid into the White House bathtub and didn't come out. He was stuck, wedged, immobile. The tub had become a porcelain prison. It took several aides to hoist him free. No one took pictures. This was 1910, not TMZ. But the tale spread quickly, transforming into an instant myth of presidential proportions. Taft, ever the pragmatist, reportedly laughed about it afterward. Did it happen exactly as described? Historians debate the details. But what's certain is that shortly after the alleged incident, a new tub was ordered for the White House, an enormous one. 7 feet long, over 3 feet wide, capable of fitting 4 grown men, a tub built not for soaking, but for dominance. Taft took it all in stride. He knew he was a large man. He joked about it, lived with it, and ultimately left office not with scandal, but suds. Ironically, after his presidency, he slimmed down significantly when he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only person to hold both positions. But the legend of the tub, that stuck. And if Taft's most famous squeeze was ceramic, Cleveland's brush with infamy came with a rope and the title of executioner. Grover Cleveland was a legal executioner as sheriff. Before he was president, before he vetoed Congress into submission, Grover Cleveland was the sheriff of Erie County, New York. And back then, sheriffs didn't just sign paperwork. They executed the condemned. Cleveland personally pulled the lever on 2 hangings. Most sheriffs hired someone else for the task, not Cleveland. He believed in the law, and if the law demanded death, then the man enforcing it shouldn't flinch. So he carried it out himself, grim-faced, precise, utterly committed. He never boasted about it, never paraded the decision. But he also never avoided it. It was one of the darkest, most morally grueling jobs in the country, and he saw it through with the same icy integrity he later brought to Washington. This wasn't just policy. It was personal. Cleveland's sense of duty ran so deep it extended to the gallows. And when he eventually vetoed more bills than any president before him, some said his time as executioner shaped that steel backbone. It also gave him a strange duality. One of America's most forgettable presidents also had one of its most unforgettable pre-presidencies. And speaking of duality, George W. Bush spent his presidency leading wars and weathering storms. But in retirement, he traded policy for portraits, and the canvas became his new battlefield. George W. Bush painted portraits of world leaders in retirement. Yes, that George W. Bush. The mission-accomplished president. The guy who once dodged shoes at a press conference in Baghdad. That same man now spends his days behind an easel, brush in hand, painting the faces of the world's most powerful people. And he's not bad. What started as a hobby blossomed into a full-blown artistic phase. Self-portraits, world leaders, war veterans. He painted Vladimir Putin with cold precision. Angela Merkel with a painter's grace. He even painted himself. In the shower. The world did a double take. Was this the same man who led 2 wars, who said strategery, now dabbing oils on canvas like a quiet old monk? But it made sense in an odd way. Bush said painting helped him reflect, helped him express what words and politics couldn't. It was therapy, redemption, introspection, poured out in color and texture. Critics were confused. Supporters were charmed. And Bush? He just kept painting. His 2017 book, Portraits of Courage, featured veterans he'd met and honored. The brush became his bridge back to humanity. And for a man so defined by division, this was his most unexpected unifier. James Buchanan called pies sweet tombs of chaos. James Buchanan, 15th president and the only bachelor ever to occupy the White House, had an eccentric palate and an even stranger relationship with language. Among his many quirks was an unshakable fear and fascination with one of America's most beloved desserts, the pie. He called them sweet tombs of chaos. He didn't mean it as a compliment. To Buchanan, pies were culinary deception. They looked innocent, inviting, golden crusts, pleasant aroma, but inside, mayhem. Berries bleeding into syrup, crusts collapsing under their own steam, sticky sweetness covering a storm of sugar, fruit acid, and molten jelly. He considered them dangerous, overly indulgent, a metaphor perhaps for temptation itself. He rarely ate them. When he did so cautiously, dissecting the contents with a fork, like a surgeon checking for explosive devices. Dinner guests noted he often pushed pie plates away mid-bite. When asked why, he muttered that pies promise structure, then deliver only collapse. Buchanan was a man of meticulous order, an obsessive scheduler, a control freak, a lover of diplomatic symmetry. A dish that crumbled on purpose, it offended his worldview. Of course, his presidency collapsed much like those pastries. His inability to take firm stances on slavery and secession helped pave the road to the Civil War. Maybe he was right. Maybe pies are chaotic. But while Buchanan stared into dessert and saw anarchy, Gerald Ford looked into a camera lens and saw opportunity. Gerald Ford modeled in college and was on the cover of Cosmopolitan before he was an unelected vice president, before he pardoned Nixon, before the pratfalls and Chevy Chase impersonations. Gerald R. Ford was a total snack. No joke. In college, Ford modeled to pay the bills. And not just yearbook headshot modeling. He was cover model material. Tall, athletic, and chiseled like a J. Crew display dummy. Ford turned heads at the University of Michigan, where he played center on the football team. His looks were undeniable. In 1942, Ford, alongside his then-girlfriend and future wife Betty, graced the cover of Cosmopolitan. Dressed in full formal wear, smiling that presidential jawline into immortality, Ford looked more like a soap opera lead than a future commander-in-chief. The juxtaposition is wild. This is the same man who would later be lampooned for tripping downstairs, who stumbled into the Oval Office during the most tense political hangover in American history, who bumbled, yes, but with the bone structure of a Roman statue. And yet, he never flaunted it. Ford was Midwestern to the core. Humble, reliable, slightly boring, but easy on the eyes. History gave him the nickname Accidental President. But that face? That was deliberate. Of course, if Ford found fame through aesthetics, Truman sought peace through discipline, waking before the sun to wage a private war on silence. Harry Truman woke at 5 a.m. to practice piano. Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher turned president, had no time for pretense, but he made time every morning at 5 a.m. for music. The piano was his ritual, his relief, his reset. Long before making decisions about nuclear weapons or navigating post-war Europe, Truman would sit in quiet rooms and press the keys. Chopin, Mozart, scales, and arpeggios, sometimes on a travel keyboard packed into his suitcase. He wasn't casual about it. He practiced like a student, relentlessly, joylessly, beautifully. Neighbors heard him at dawn back in Missouri. White House staff learned to tiptoe as nocturnal quiet gave way to measured keystrokes and slow trills. To Truman, the piano was more than a hobby. It was a philosophy. In an unpredictable world, music had rules. Notes followed each other with intention. Harmonies resolved. Mistakes could be corrected. There's something poignant about that. A president remembered for the biggest military decision in human history began his days not with war councils or briefings, but with Bach. The rhythm gave him calm, and the calm gave him strength. Franklin Pierce banned cheese from his meals, thought it caused nightmares. Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, was haunted by many things. The loss of all 3 of his children, his wife's relentless melancholy, a presidency derailed by bleeding Kansas and a nation edging toward war. But among his quieter phantoms was cheese. Pierce banned it from the White House, not because of taste, not because of allergies, but because he believed, wholeheartedly, that cheese caused nightmares. He wasn't alone in this belief. In the 19th century, folk medicine and pseudoscience roamed freely through the dinner table. Cheese, especially the soft, moldy varieties, was thought to ferment mischief in the stomach, to release vapors, to summon fever dreams. Pierce embraced this idea fully. No cheddar, no brie, no Gruyere with state dinners. His meals were designed to be dream-proof, blunt, bland, and ghost-free. And you can't really blame him. The man's life was a nightmare. His son was decapitated in a train crash just weeks before his inauguration. His wife wore black for most of his term. His presidency unraveled into conflict and indecision. So yes, maybe banning cheese was a small, desperate rebellion against dreams, against fate, against anything that might steal a second more of his peace. But where Pierce muted his meals, John Tyler added music to his memos. John Tyler sang his correspondence when dictating. Most presidents dictated letters like generals issue commands, but John Tyler, he preferred to sing them. Seriously, Tyler, 10th president, father of 15, and owner of a voice better suited to opera than oratory, reportedly sang his dictation, as in literal melodies, notes rising and falling as he issued official messages to Congress or private thoughts to his cabinet. Aides learned to transcribe through the tune. Secretaries adapted. The East Room echoed not with stern declarations, but with lyrical semicolons. Why? Maybe because Tyler adored music. He was a violinist, a lover of operas, and considered the arts essential to civil life. Maybe it was an affectation, a performance for his staff. Or maybe, in a sea of suits and seriousness, it was his way of injecting humanity into policy. There's no record of the notes he used. No surviving sheet music for the Whig Party lament in D minor. But the image sticks. A president standing at his desk, intoning vetoes like arias, sending baritone dispatches to history. And while Tyler orchestrated his letters with vocal flair, Jefferson was reinventing furniture, turning a chair into a Declaration of Independence from immobility. Thomas Jefferson invented the swivel chair. Thomas Jefferson didn't just draft the Declaration of Independence, he spun through it. That's because he invented, or at least modified into modern form, the swivel chair. While serving as vice president and later president, Jefferson grew frustrated with stationary seats. He needed something that matched his restless mind and roving attention. So he took a Windsor-style chair, installed a central iron spindle, and gave it the power of rotation. Voila! The birth of the presidential swivel chair. He used it constantly, especially while drafting foundational documents. Monticello records suggest it never left his writing room. It turned with him, allowed him to pivot between papers, globe, and thoughts. It became an extension of his process, perpetual motion in pursuit of clarity. He eventually added casters, making it mobile. And over time, the idea spread. By the 19th century, rotating chairs were everywhere, from banks to boardrooms. Today, we take them for granted. But once, that quiet swish of turning was revolutionary. Jefferson never patented it, didn't name it. But he left behind blueprints. His swivel was just another tool in a long list of personal inventions, dumbwaiters, cryptographs, and now, office furniture. Jimmy Carter was once attacked by a swimming rabbit. No, this isn't a political cartoon. It happened. It was real. And it was weird. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, was quietly fishing alone in a flat-bottomed boat near his home in Plains, Georgia in 1979. It was meant to be a peaceful moment. A president in nature, rod in hand, untangling more than just his line. Then came the rabbit. It wasn't a Bugs Bunny moment. It wasn't cute. It was frantic. This rabbit swam, mind you, directly at Carter's boat. Fast, splashing, eyes wide, desperate, or possibly homicidal. Carter described it as a swamp rabbit, flailing its way through the water, clearly agitated, possibly fleeing a predator. As it approached, he panicked, grabbing a paddle and splashing water to ward it off. Yes, that's right. The President of the United States was swinging at a swimming rabbit with a canoe paddle. When he returned to the White House and told staff, they didn't believe him. A rabbit? Swimming? Attacking? It sounded absurd, until a White House photographer confirmed it with an actual photo, which hilariously was later dubbed the Killer Rabbit Incident. The press ran with it. Editorial cartoons exploded, and Carter, who had already been mocked as a weak president, was now being hunted by amphibious rodents. But what's most bizarre? The rabbit wasn't even the weirdest part of Carter's legacy. This is the same man who filed UFO sightings, installed solar panels on the White House roof, and brokered Middle East peace treaties in the same week. Rabbits were just the warm-up. And speaking of warm-ups, our next president took home music's biggest prize, not with a guitar, but with his voice. Bill Clinton won a Grammy for Best Spoken Word Album. Slick Willie, Bubba, saxophone guy, you know the vibe. But add Grammy-winning artist to Bill Clinton's resume, because in 2004, the man walked away with a golden gramophone without ever hitting a single note. The category, Best Spoken Word Album. The winning work? My Life, Clinton's own audiobook, which he read with that gravelly Arkansas cadence and occasional preacher rhythm. He beat out heavyweights that year, including Garrison Keillor and, yes, Barack Obama. This wasn't his first brush with the arts. As a teenager, Clinton idolized jazz, played saxophone, jammed on the Arsenio Hall Show. But this was different. This was industry recognition. From the Recording Academy, he joined a small club of political performers, Jimmy Carter, Obama, Hillary Clinton, all Grammy winners for memoir readings. But Bill stood out because of that voice, folksy, smooth, occasionally off script in that way only Clinton could get away with. Critics liked it. Listeners loved it. And somewhere between global diplomacy and campaign finance reform, Clinton became a rock star for the audiobook crowd. But while Clinton laid down tracks in the studio, Andrew Johnson was laying something else on the White House lawn. Something with hooves. Andrew Johnson kept goats on the White House lawn. Andrew Johnson, tailor by trade, impeached by history, wasn't exactly known for his charm. But during his short and tumultuous time in the White House, he had a peculiar fondness for a particular kind of company. Goats. Yes, actual goats, on the lawn. Like presidential lawnmowers with horns and attitudes. Why goats? Possibly for the children. Johnson's grandchildren lived in the White House during his term, and goats made for cheap, low-maintenance entertainment. They grazed, they bleated, they headbutted each other in front of dignitaries. It was basically an Appalachian petting zoo at the center of the American executive branch. But it wasn't just play. Johnson grew up poor, barely literate until adulthood. He felt more comfortable around animals than elite company. The goats were probably a little piece of home, wandering the South Lawn as if they belonged more than Congress did. Visitors were baffled. Ambassadors dodged droppings. Diplomats paused mid-handshake as bleats rang out across the portico. And Johnson? He barely acknowledged the chaos. He had bigger problems, like Reconstruction, and trying not to get fired. But those goats? They never judged him. George Washington brewed his own beer and whiskey. Before he was etched into currency and carved into mountainsides, George Washington was a brewer and distiller. Not metaphorically, not as a dabbler, as a full-blown alcohol entrepreneur. At Mount Vernon, he brewed his own beer, mild and unfiltered, rich with molasses. It wasn't fancy, it was functional. Beer in colonial America was safer than water and smoother than revolution. Washington's go-to recipe called for spruce, hops, and rye. The result? A drink that tasted like liquid bread dipped in bark. But that was just the start. In 1797, after finishing his second term as president, Washington went even bigger. He built a whiskey distillery, a massive one. Using enslaved labor and Scottish expertise, he churned out more than 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey in 1799 alone, making Mount Vernon one of the largest distilleries in the new United States. The irony is palpable. The man who once led troops to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion became one of its most prolific suppliers, and he took pride in it. He reviewed the accounting, adjusted recipes, demanded quality. This wasn't a side project, it was a business. One that made money, built reputation, and kept the American spirit, pun intended, flowing. So when you picture George Washington, forget the stoic portrait. Picture him with sleeves rolled up, steam rising from copper stills, balancing nation-building with rye fermentation. And while Washington brewed with grit and ambition, another president spiced things up with a little chili heat and kept the recipe under tight control. Barack Obama's favorite food is chili. He has a personal recipe. Barack Obama may be the cool, polished, eloquent statesman of the 21st century, but his go-to meal? A humble, hearty, Midwestern-style chili. And he makes it himself. Obama has carried his personal chili recipe from his college years to the White House. It's no joke. He's published it. It includes kidney beans, green pepper, onion, garlic, ground turkey, or beef, and a big scoop of straightforward spice. No pretense, no Instagram garnish. It's the meal he cooked for Michelle when they were dating. The meal he made for friends while studying law. The dish he whipped up when he wanted to ground himself, even amid the blur of speeches and motorcades. Staff confirmed. On certain nights, you'd find the President of the United States sautéing onions and measuring cumin, insisting on getting it just right. Not too soupy, not too thick, and no cinnamon, thank you very much. Chili is comfort. It's memory. It's the taste of quiet confidence. And for a man who carried the hopes of a nation, it was one small ritual that remained entirely his own. Meanwhile, a different president satisfied his cravings with something a bit more colorful. Ronald Reagan loved jelly beans and kept jars around the Oval Office. Ronald Reagan didn't just like jelly beans. He turned them into a political aesthetic. It began when he quit smoking. To curb the habit, Reagan reached for jelly beans, especially the brand Jelly Belly. He kept them nearby at all times, eventually requesting a personal supply to be delivered to Sacramento while he was governor of California. By the time he reached the White House, the jars had multiplied. The Oval Office, Air Force One, cabinet meetings, state dinners. There were jelly beans at the Pentagon, jelly beans in diplomatic pouches, jelly beans in zero gravity sent on the Space Shuttle Challenger as part of a presidential promotion. Reagan had a favorite, licorice. He once joked it was the black gold of candy, but he kept all flavors in rotation. Guests would nervously nibble while discussing nuclear disarmament, trying not to look like they were playing Candyland at DEFCON 2. It became a symbol, a quirk, a brand. Jelly Belly even created a Reagan mix in red, white, and blue. By the time he left office, jelly beans had become a footnote of diplomacy. Soft, chewy, oddly reassuring. Because nothing says leader of the free world like a candy jar passed around the Situation Room. Herbert Hoover spoke Mandarin with his wife. Picture this, the Oval Office, quiet, calm. A phone rings, a staffer enters. The president turns to his wife and replies, not in English, not in Latin, but in fluent Mandarin Chinese. That's not a Cold War spy thriller. That was Herbert Hoover, Before becoming the 31st president, Hoover spent years in China as a mining engineer, where he and his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, lived, worked, and, most surprisingly, learned the language. Mandarin became their secret code. They spoke it at home, at dinner, even in the White House, if they wanted privacy in a room full of English speakers. It wasn't perfect. Hoover's accent was described as clunky, Lou's as near native, but the result? A multilingual White House couple decades before globalism was trendy. They were a brilliant pair. Lou was Stanford educated, the first lady to give a radio address, and the only one to serve as her husband's personal translator in a language more presidents can't pronounce than can. Why Mandarin? Why not French or Latin, the languages of classical statecraft? Because Herbert and Lou lived it. They were in China during the Boxer Rebellion, shelled for weeks, dodging death while rationing food and coordinating defense. Learning the language wasn't just romantic, it was survival. It became a bond, a memory, a code they never gave up. And if Hoover used language to stay one step ahead, Coolidge used gadgets to toy with people's patience. Calvin Coolidge pushed a buzzer to make Secret Service come, but just to watch them arrive. Silent Cal was famously introverted, dry as a saltine, known for saying little and doing even less, unless, of course, it involved screwing with his staff. Coolidge had a buzzer installed in the Oval Office, standard security stuff. But instead of using it for emergencies, he sometimes pressed it just to watch the Secret Service show up. No reason, no crisis, no threat. Just buzz, wait, door opens, confused agents appear. Coolidge would sit perfectly still, hands folded, silent, staring, like a cat who knocked over a vase and dared you to say something. Sometimes he did it multiple times a day. Sometimes he said nothing needed and went back to reading. Other times he didn't say a word at all. It wasn't malice, it was boredom, or a dry sense of humor so bone dry it could powder drywall. This was a man who once told a waiter he was just meditating when caught napping during a state dinner. The agents, to their credit, kept coming. Maybe they hoped one day he'd actually need help. Maybe they wanted to be there when the buzzer finally meant something. Spoiler, it never did. But while Coolidge toyed with his protectors, the real party was happening 2 generations earlier, when the author of the Constitution passed out drunk on his best friend's floor. James Madison once slept on Thomas Jefferson's floor after too much wine. James Madison was tiny, polite, and quietly intense, the kind of man who measured his words with tweezers. But one evening in the vineyards of Virginia, he measured his wine. Poorly. It was a night at Monticello. Thomas Jefferson, ever the generous host, had uncorked bottle after bottle of the good stuff. French imports, aged reds. Toasts were made. The Constitution praised. Liberty toasted. And Madison, normally reserved, kept sipping. By night's end, he wasn't walking straight. He wasn't really walking at all. Instead of staggering home, Madison simply collapsed, right there, on the floor of Jefferson's study, and slept. No scandal, no shame, just 2 founding fathers, 1 couch too few, and the afterglow of political wine talk gone too far. Jefferson reportedly found it hilarious. Madison, the next morning, mortified. But it wasn't the last time. These men weren't just allies. They were drinking buddies. Philosophical soulmates who also knew how to let loose when the corks popped. It's a rare image. The man who crafted the Bill of Rights snoring in a powdered wig, surrounded by crumpled parchment and half-full glasses. Founding liberty 1 sip at a time. William McKinley wore a lucky red carnation until the day he died. For William McKinley, 25th President of the United States, good fortune came in the shape of a single red carnation. He wore one on his lapel constantly, a lucky charm in petal form, a symbol, a talisman, a superstition dressed in floral cheer. McKinley believed in omens. He believed this little flower brought him peace, focus, maybe even protection. He wore it everywhere, speeches, photo ops, campaign rallies. The bloom became part of his image, buttoned up, polite, quietly confident. his very own Scarlet Shield. Then came Buffalo, September 6, 1901. McKinley was shaking hands at the Pan American Exposition, working the crowd, greeting citizens, smiling as always with his red carnation blooming brightly on his chest. And then he gave it away. A little girl stood in front of him, eyes wide. McKinley smiled, plucked the carnation from his lapel, and tucked it into her hand. Moments later, an anarchist stepped forward and shot him twice. The flower was gone. It's eerie, haunting. One moment, a gesture of kindness, a child's souvenir, and the next, chaos. McKinley lingered for 8 days, battling infection and fever, before finally dying. The carnation became a tragic relic, its absence forever stitched into the timeline. Today, the red carnation is Ohio's state flower in McKinley's honor, a symbol of luck, loyalty, and a reminder that sometimes even a charm runs out of power. And if McKinley's flower wilted on impact, George H.W. Bush chose a far more active enemy, broccoli. George H.W. Bush banned broccoli from Air Force One. Let it be known, George Herbert Walker Bush, 41st President of the United States, hated broccoli. He didn't dislike it. He declared war on it. "I do not like broccoli," he famously told reporters, "and I haven't liked it since I was a little kid, and my mother made me eat it. And I'm President of the United States now, and I'm not going to eat any more broccoli." Then came the decree. Broccoli was officially banned from Air Force One. The vegetable was exiled, not even allowed to breathe the same recycled cabin air as the commander-in-chief. Staffers, chefs, aides, no one dared smuggle florets on board. Farmers were outraged. Shipments were rerouted. Reporters pounced. But Bush stood firm, defending his anti-broccoli platform with the gusto of a man vetoing legislation. His stance turned into a cultural moment. Late-night jokes, editorial cartoons, protest boxes of broccoli sent to the White House. And through it all, Bush never flinched. "Just because I'm president doesn't mean I have to eat it," he insisted. In the pantheon of presidential declarations, banning a vegetable might seem petty, but it was also oddly relatable. A reminder that even presidents draw the line somewhere, and sometimes that line is green, fibrous, and steamed. And if Bush fought his war with a fork, Joe Biden fought his battle with something far more internal, his own voice. Joe Biden stutters and overcame it by reading poetry aloud. Joe Biden's most enduring struggle wasn't political. It wasn't ideological. It was personal, deeply so. He stuttered. As a boy, his speech would catch, loop, betray him. Sounds wouldn't come. Words froze in his throat. Teachers mocked him. Classmates imitated him. He was called Stutterin' Joe, a name that rang in his ears long after the bell. But Biden didn't give in. He went to war with syllables, and his weapon? Poetry. He would stand in front of a mirror, gripping the sink, reading Yeats and Emerson aloud, over and over, practicing rhythm, learning breath control, treating poems like drills, pacing his voice, shaping his stutter into cadence. It worked. The boy who once struggled to say his own name became a senator at 29, then a 2-term vice president, and ultimately president. Along the way, he met kids like him, spoke to them, encouraged them, showed them the mirror. He never entirely erased the stutter, and that's the point. He carried it, carved it into his narrative like a scar that became a flag. Biden's story isn't just about overcoming a speech disorder. It's about resilience, the belief that voice matters, not just the sound, but the effort it takes to say anything at all. Chester Arthur redecorated the White House with Lewis Comfort Tiffany stained glass, before HGTV, before Pinterest. Before presidential aesthetics became a marketing tool, there was Chester A. Arthur, unexpected president, secret style icon, and a man who entered the White House and promptly said, "This place is a dump." Arthur, 21st president, didn't run for office. He inherited it after Garfield was assassinated. But he stepped into the executive mansion like he'd been planning a renovation for years. The walls were grimy. The furniture? Civil War leftovers. So Arthur did what no one expected from a former machine politician. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany. Yes, that Tiffany, the son of the jeweler, master of Art Nouveau, and soon-to-be icon of stained glass. Arthur handed him the keys and said, "Go wild," and Tiffany delivered. He replaced drab windows with glittering rainbow-hued stained glass. He installed a massive opalescent glass screen between the main hall and the stairwell. He painted, gilded, upholstered. He transformed the White House into a Gilded Age wonderland, equal parts opera house and cathedral. It was bold. It was decadent. It was very not Victorian stiff. Critics were scandalized. Supporters were stunned. But Arthur didn't care. He hosted fashion-forward receptions, wore tailored suits, grew the world's finest mustache. Then he left office, and eventually so did the Tiffany glass. Much of it was removed in later renovations. Elegance sacrificed to modern tastes and historical revisionism. Still, for one shimmering moment, the White House glowed. And it was all thanks to a president with something to prove and a deep love for luminous flair. Meanwhile, a different early president spent far less time on decor and far more on existential math. John Adams sometimes tallied how many people respected him each day. John Adams kept score, not in games, but in life. The man who helped birth a nation and defend the Declaration also suffered from deep insecurity. His diaries reveal a mind constantly ranking, measuring, counting. Specifically, who liked him that day. Seriously, he tallied it. He'd write things like, 3 today. Jefferson nodded. Abigail agreed. Franklin insulted me only twice. He obsessed over slights, real or imagined. Social encounters were spreadsheets. Respect was a commodity. He wanted approval as badly as he wanted liberty. Adams didn't fake humility. He wanted to be great. He knew he was brilliant. But he couldn't shake the gnawing fear that no one noticed. Or worse, they did, and still didn't care. This daily accounting wasn't just neurotic. It was heartbreaking. He fought for revolution, drafted treaties, helped create the presidency. But every night he looked into the quiet and asked, was it enough? Was I enough? And despite all his achievements, the man who helped craft America's soul spent many nights trying to convince himself that someone respected him. If Adams kept his insecurities in ink, FDR hid something else, something far more physical, from the public eye altogether. Franklin D. Roosevelt's legs were paralyzed from polio, but many photos hid it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't just a president. He was a symbol of resilience, recovery, determination. But what most Americans didn't know, what they weren't allowed to see, was that FDR couldn't walk on his own. In 1921, at age 39, Roosevelt contracted polio. The disease left his legs permanently paralyzed. He could stand only with braces, walk only with help. He trained himself to walk by swinging his hips and bracing on someone's arm. But every step was calculated performance. And here's where history gets edited in real time. FDR's team, along with the press, conspired to hide the extent of his disability. Photos were staged, angles chosen, braces cropped out. Reporters agreed not to shoot him in motion. It was a silent pact. Show the man, not the chair. Not out of shame, but out of strategy. In an America still brutal to the disabled, FDR believed visibility might mean vulnerability. So he crafted an image of strength, not deception, deflection. And yet, that very silence made his triumphs louder. 4 terms, the Great Depression, World War II, fireside chats that made fear retreat, and all while his body whispered pain with every breath. He never publicly leaned on the struggle. But it was always there, beneath the desk, behind the podium, inside the man. James Buchanan refused to eat food with more than one texture. James Buchanan, the only bachelor president and arguably one of the most peculiar men to ever set foot in the Oval Office, had a rule that makes picky eaters look like culinary adventurers. He refused to eat food with more than one texture. No sauces with chunks, no crusty exteriors hiding gooey centers. No creamy mashed something next to crispy baked anything. If the meal had textural variety, Buchanan passed. His daily diet was an exercise in bland symmetry. Porridges, soft breads, unadorned meats. He had a particular fondness for finely minced dishes where everything, flavor, feel, even color, was uniform. One bite felt like the next. That was the point. He claimed it was for digestive peace, but those close to him noted that he simply couldn't handle surprises, especially edible ones. A stew would send him into a silent spiral. A salad with too many ingredients? Psychological sabotage. This obsession with control wasn't limited to the dinner table. Buchanan's presidency, marked by indecision and passivity in the face of looming civil war, echoed his culinary philosophy: avoid complexity at all costs. He wanted smoothness, simplicity, predictability, but the nation was already simmering into catastrophe. The era demanded appetite for chaos, something Buchanan had long since banned from his plate. If Buchanan was paralyzed by texture, Millard Fillmore once made an entire city pause for something even stranger: the sanctity of his shadow. Millard Fillmore stopped a parade because someone stepped on his shadow. Millard Fillmore, the answer to your favorite Who president joke, once halted a parade in full procession, not because of danger or disrespect or scheduling, but because a man stepped on his shadow. Yes, that happened. It was in Buffalo during his post-presidency period as Fillmore was marching at the head of a civic parade. Crowds cheered, bands played, flags waved. And then, as the sun angled just right, a fellow marcher accidentally placed his foot squarely on Fillmore's projected silhouette. The former president froze, scowled, stepped aside, refused to continue. He reportedly muttered something about preserving dignity, then stood glaring until the man moved out of alignment. Only then did Fillmore resume his march, deliberate, defiant, his shadow once again his own. To him, this wasn't superstition. It was symbolism. A man's shadow was his essence, his legacy, his untouchable extension. To trample it, even by accident, was to trample the office, the republic, and the man himself. In that one moment, Fillmore, often dismissed as a placeholder president, revealed the full absurd majesty of political ego. Not content with physical power, he demanded sovereignty over light. Meanwhile, a very different president, quiet, gentle, restrained, found his strength not in light or showmanship, but in melody. Played low, at dusk. Rutherford B Hayes played the harmonica at sunset for lung health. Rutherford B Hayes wasn't a flamboyant president. He didn't grandstand. He didn't duel. But he did have one ritual that for sheer earnestness outshines the flashiest gestures of his contemporaries. He played the harmonica at sunset. Every day. For his lungs. He believed it kept his respiratory system healthy, an early blend of medical theory and musical meditation. The harmonica, portable and precise, became his twilight companion. As the sun dipped behind the Ohio treetops, Hayes would retreat to a quiet porch, lift the tiny instrument to his lips, and blow slow, patient notes into the evening. No staff, no fanfare, just breath and brass. A hymn to wellness. It wasn't just a health tactic. It was Hayes' form of control, a way to center himself after a day of political conflict and compromise. In a time before therapy and spin cycles, he found balance in sound waves. Neighbors heard the melodies, sometimes melancholy, sometimes hopeful. They said it became a kind of evening bell for the village, a breath that the president shared with the world, one soft note at a time. Andrew Jackson was shot in a duel and carried the bullet for decades. Andrew Jackson was not built for modern diplomacy. He was built for blood feuds, vendettas, and calculated rage. Before he ever stepped foot in the White House, Jackson was a walking powder keg. And one duel cemented that reputation forever. It was 1806. The man who insulted his wife, Charles Dickinson, stood across from Jackson in a field. Pistols drawn, seconds ready, honor on the line. Dickinson was known as one of the best shots in Tennessee. He fired first. The bullet slammed into Jackson's chest, cracking ribs and nearly shredding his heart. But Jackson didn't fall. He didn't react. He stood, bloody and upright, took his time, raised his own pistol, and shot Dickinson dead. Then he turned and walked away. Doctors were horrified. The bullet had missed his heart by barely an inch. Removing it was too dangerous. So Jackson just kept it for 39 years inside him until the day he died. And that wasn't the only one. Jackson carried multiple bullets in his body from various brawls and shootouts, like a man collecting iron souvenirs from his enemies. At times, he coughed up blood. He wheezed. He couldn't sleep on one side. But he never complained. Why? Because pain to Jackson was just proof that he'd survived. He wore it like a badge, a part of him that never healed, just like his presidency. If Jackson carried pain like a trophy, Lincoln turned his emotional overwhelm into something far more poetic and grotesquely relatable. Abraham Lincoln called himself unchewed gristle when overwhelmed. Abraham Lincoln was a man of metaphors. Most presidents tried to sound dignified. Lincoln sounded like a mournful philosopher who moonlighted as a butcher's assistant. In one particularly rough stretch, overwhelmed with war, politics, grief, and the impossible weight of a fractured nation, he described himself not as tired, not as drained, but as unchewed gristle. That was Lincoln. Brutal, vivid, painfully honest. He didn't say he was tired. He said he was something your jaw gives up on. This wasn't just dark humor. It was Lincoln's coping mechanism. He wielded language like a scalpel, dissecting his own despair in public view. Letters, speeches, even casual remarks were laced with sorrow sharpened by irony. This is the man who said people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be, while writing eulogies to a dying republic. Who walked the halls of the White House like a ghost in his own life. Who buried 2 sons, managed the bloodiest war in American history, and still found time to roast himself with metaphors about meat scraps. Unchewed gristle wasn't just a joke. It was an emotional state, a descriptor of what happens when the world chews on you and spits you back out. But you're still here, raw, tough, unbroken. If Lincoln used metaphor to survive, Jefferson used avoidance, not emotionally, physically. Staring people in the eye, far too confrontational. Thomas Jefferson avoided eye contact so much it unnerved guests. Thomas Jefferson was many things: philosopher, inventor, writer, violinist, slaveholder, president. But one thing he was not: comfortable with eye contact. Visitors to Monticello and the White House frequently noted how Jefferson would look. Anywhere else. At the wall, the window, his own shoes, his quill. Anywhere but directly into your soul. It wasn't rudeness. It was intensity avoidance. Jefferson preferred correspondence over conversation, ink over intimacy. He was fluent in Enlightenment ideals, but emotionally, he operated like a lighthouse, bright from a distance, cold up close. Guests found it eerie. Conversations felt like monologues. You'd ask a question, and Jefferson would respond, thoughtfully, elegantly, while watching a painting or studying the trim on the ceiling. This avoidance became legendary. Political opponents called him aloof. Admirers called him cerebral. In truth, he was just an introvert running the country like a philosophy seminar. He didn't hate people, he just preferred them. At a distance, with boundaries. Preferably written in neat cursive and sent by horseback. John Quincy Adams fasted for spiritual calibration. John Quincy Adams didn't just believe in discipline, he lived it. Obsessed with routine, tortured by purpose, the 6th president scheduled his life down to the minute. But when that wasn't enough, he would stop eating altogether. Not for politics, not for health, but for what he called spiritual calibration. That phrase, utterly strange, vaguely mystical, was Adams's way of resetting his soul. When overwhelmed by decisions, paralyzed by grief, or simply disgusted with the state of humanity, he would fast. Sometimes for a day, sometimes longer. Water only. Silence preferred. Reflection mandatory. It wasn't a diet. It wasn't a cleanse. It was a ritual. He believed abstaining from food removed distractions, that it purged the mind, aligned the soul, cleared the fog between thought and divinity. It was also punishing. Adams, always thin, became gaunt during these periods. But he welcomed the pain, called hunger a focusing agent. He even recorded these episodes in his meticulous diary, logging hunger pangs alongside congressional roll calls. To the modern eye, it reads like a strange collision of stoicism and self-punishment. But for Adams, it was sacred, a way to stay clean in a world that felt perpetually soiled. And if fasting stripped him of indulgence, another president fought temptation from a different source, his own reflection. James Madison feared mirrors, believing they encouraged vanity. James Madison, father of the Constitution, and the shortest president in U.S. history, wasn't known for flash. But few knew just how deeply he distrusted mirrors. He thought they bred vanity, that to see oneself too often was to love oneself too much. And for a man who believed humility was the highest virtue, this was a problem. He avoided mirrors when possible. In his Virginia home, some guests noted that many rooms had none, or they were draped. If he passed a reflection by accident, he was said to glance away quickly, as though catching a glimpse of something indecent. Madison believed public service demanded self-forgetting, and he treated his own image like a temptation. It was part theology, part psychology, part personal discomfort. He wasn't wrong either. Madison lived in an age when image was becoming political currency. But he refused to play that game. His portraits are stiff, minimal, unsmiling. Records, not promotions. In a town that runs on mirrors today, Madison was the ghost who walked among them, refusing to look himself in the eye. But if Madison feared his own reflection, Ulysses S. Grant feared something far more physical and far more ironic. Ulysses S. Grant hated the sight of blood. Let that sit. Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War general, victor at Shiloh, Vicksburg, Appomattox, the man whose campaigns bled thousands, the architect of total war, hated blood, not metaphorically, viscerally. He couldn't look at it. His stomach turned, his head spun. During surgeries or field operations, he'd go pale, step away, cover his mouth. This wasn't cowardice. Grant was fearless in battle. He rode into gunfire. He endured shrapnel. He commanded armies with steel in his gaze. But blood, real, warm, human blood, repulsed him. He once nearly fainted watching an amputation. Another time he vomited after walking through a tent full of wounded men. It wasn't weakness. It was wiring. A contradiction so sharp it borders on poetic. And maybe that's why he was so aggressive in war. Because he hated the aftermath. He knew the cost of every order, every siege, every advance. The gore wasn't abstract to him. It was visceral. He didn't glorify war. He got drunk because of it, wrote sober memoirs to explain it, and led as if trying to end it as fast as possible. George Washington collected teeth from enslaved people for dentures. The myth is wrong. George Washington's teeth were not wooden. But the truth? It's worse. Washington's dentures were crafted from a grotesque variety of materials: ivory, lead, horse teeth, cow teeth, and yes, human teeth. Specifically, he purchased them from enslaved individuals. His financial records include entries for payments to unnamed enslaved people in exchange for their teeth. Let that sink in. The first president of the United States, champion of liberty, icon of the Republic, the marble man on the dollar bill, wore the teeth of the enslaved in his mouth while speaking of freedom. It wasn't unusual for the time. Dentistry was brutal, and human teeth were considered premium replacements. But most people bought them from poor laborers or war dead. Washington? He had a ready supply, a plantation full of people who couldn't say no. There's no evidence he yanked them himself, but the transaction was transactional only for one party. They got a few coins. He got a set of molars. And still, his teeth plagued him. He suffered from infections, swelling, and constant jaw pain. He wrote letters in agony. His dentures distorted his speech, making him sound stiff and awkward. Perhaps it was karma, or just the era's medical horror, but there's a strange, haunting symmetry to it. The man whose mouth declared independence was, quite literally, using the bodies of the unfree to do it. If Washington's nightmares were dental, Franklin Pierce's were more apocalyptic and strangely accurate. Franklin Pierce had nightmares predicting national disasters. Franklin Pierce, 14th president and one of the most tragic figures to hold the office, didn't just have nightmares. He had prophecies. He claimed to dream of floods, fires, and societal collapse. Sometimes months before disasters actually happened. The 1857 economic panic? He said he dreamed of banks collapsing and gold turning to ash. Bleeding Kansas? He told confidants of nightmares about rivers running red. Pierce was no mystic, but he believed deeply in fate and guilt. His life was marinated in grief. All three of his sons died young. The last, Benjamin, was decapitated in a train accident in front of Pierce and his wife just weeks before inauguration. After that, the nightmares intensified. He became obsessed with symbols. Owls meant war. Thunderstorms meant betrayal. He started avoiding meetings on certain days, refused particular travel routes, and once postponed a bill signing because of a dark omen in a dream. Staff whispered. Senators rolled eyes. But Pierce believed in dreams, in signs, in some invisible countdown to catastrophe. And in a way, he was right. His presidency floundered into civil unrest. He saw the storm coming, but lacked the strength to steer away. While Pierce read his fate in nightmares, James Monroe once missed the memo entirely. James Monroe forgot his own birthday one year. James Monroe, 5th president and last of the founding fathers to sit in the Oval Office, was many things: diplomat, soldier, governor, but apparently not a fan of birthday cake. Because one year, he simply forgot his own birthday. It wasn't a publicity stunt. There were no tweets, no calendars plastered with countdowns. Monroe was traveling, working, and fully immersed in matters of state when someone casually mentioned the date. He blinked, did the math, realized, oh, that's today. And then he shrugged. Monroe never made a big deal of his birth date. He didn't throw parties, didn't pause for reflection. He treated birthdays like old receipts, only worth mentioning if they led to something useful. It fit his vibe. Monroe was famously low drama, dull even by some accounts. He once held a reception where a guest described the mood as funereal. His idea of celebration was a successful treaty, or maybe a quiet dinner without diplomatic insult. So forgetting his birthday wasn't out of character. It was almost symbolic. A president who blended duty so thoroughly into identity that he lost track of when it all began. William Henry Harrison believed burnt orange peels repelled illness. William Henry Harrison didn't have much time to make an impact, unless you count his record-setting short presidency, 31 days. But even in that brief window, the man managed to bring his frontier logic into the White House, including one peculiar health habit: burning orange peels to ward off disease. He swore by it. The scent, the smoke, the ritual, it was more than just colonial aromatherapy. Harrison believed that the act of burning dried citrus rinds could purify the air, chase out bad humors, block infection, keep away the mysterious miasmas that 19th century medicine blamed for just about everything. You could often find him with a fire crackling, tossing in slivers of orange peel like it was sacred incense. Staffers tolerated the practice, mostly because they didn't want to argue with a man who had fought in more battles than he'd attended formal dinners. It didn't work, of course. Just weeks into his term, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in U.S. history, in the cold, without a coat or hat. Then he promptly fell ill, possibly with pneumonia, possibly typhoid. Either way, the orange peels did not save him. He died a month after taking office. The first president to die in office. The shortest presidency in American history. All those burnt peels, all that belief. and the only thing he repelled was a second month in power. Meanwhile, a later president chose to decorate the executive mansion with a little more thread work. Andrew Johnson hung tailor patterns in the Oval Office as decor. Andrew Johnson was many things: a stubborn Tennessean, an embattled Reconstruction president, and the first commander-in-chief to be impeached. But before any of that, he was a tailor, a real one. Sewing, stitching, pressing, suits and coats made by hand. And when he ascended to the presidency after Lincoln's assassination, he didn't leave that part of himself behind. He framed it. Johnson famously decorated the Oval Office with tailor patterns, pieces of parchment cut into shoulder lines, sleeve arcs, and lapel curves. Not symbolic ones, actual leftover blueprints from his sewing days, hung like war medals. He considered it grounding, a reminder of humble origins, that he came from calloused hands, not powdered wigs. But to visitors it was confusing. Senators would pause mid-meeting, glancing at a paper labeled Chest 38.5 Tapered, and wonder if they'd wandered into a haberdashery. Johnson saw politics as an extension of tailoring. Fit the nation, cut it where it bulges, patch what's torn. The problem? The country wasn't a suit. It was unraveling, and his tools weren't sharp enough to stop the seams from splitting. Still, the tailor's touch remained on the walls long after the presidency tried to rip it away. And speaking of tailoring, Zachary Taylor didn't believe in utensils or etiquette. Zachary Taylor ate with his fingers at formal dinners. Zachary Taylor, known to his soldiers as Old Rough and Ready, brought battlefield habits straight to the White House dining room. The biggest? He ate everything with his fingers. Formal state dinner, roasted duck, pear compote with decorative garnish, didn't matter. Taylor would grab, tear, and chew like he was crouched behind a campfire. Foreign dignitaries were stunned. Guests froze mid-bite. At one banquet, a European ambassador reportedly dropped his fork in horror, watching Taylor gnaw a drumstick clean with all the grace of a raccoon in a dumpster. But Taylor didn't care. He saw utensils as unnecessary pretension. Forks were for people trying to impress others. He'd survived dysentery in the swamp, led troops in the Mexican-American War. What could a salad fork teach him about honor? And his defenders spun it brilliantly. This was the people's president. Practical, unaffected. A man who didn't need silverware to feel in charge. Of course, others just thought he was rude. But whether it was burnt citrus for health, cloth patterns for nostalgia, or chicken legs over etiquette, one thing's clear. When presidents get weird, they don't go halfway. John Quincy Adams trained himself to read upside down. John Quincy Adams didn't just read books, he devoured them. Consumed knowledge like other men inhaled cigars. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, German, and even dabbled in Russian and Dutch. But none of that was enough. Adams wanted a challenge. So naturally, he taught himself to read upside down. Why? Because it was hard. Because it trained the brain. Because when your mind is sharper than the room you're in, you find ways to raise the difficulty level. He would flip books on purpose, letters, newspapers, even legal documents, and not just tilt your head and squint upside down, fully inverted, 180 degrees, as casually as you or I might scroll a phone. This wasn't a party trick, it was discipline, a mental workout, the intellectual equivalent of doing pull-ups with one arm while reciting Cicero. It served him well. In Congress, Adams was famous for scanning correspondence faster than his peers. He could read notes passed behind his back. Once, during a House debate, he shocked a fellow representative by correcting a misquote from an upside-down pamphlet across the table. And it fit his whole vibe. Precise, intense, absolutely joyless in the best way. Reading upside down wasn't eccentricity, it was armor. In a world of bluff and bluster, Adams armed himself with clarity. Even if it meant viewing the world from the wrong angle to get it right. Meanwhile, another founding father never got to view the most iconic presidential home from any angle at all. George Washington never lived in the White House, the most famous house in America. the most iconic address, the building synonymous with executive power. And George Washington? He never stepped foot inside. Why? Timing. Construction on the White House began in 1792 during Washington's presidency. He helped choose the site, approved the design, oversaw the layout. But by the time it was completed in 1800, he'd been out of office for over a year and dead for nearly a year more. So the man for whom the capital city is named never lived in its centerpiece. Instead, Washington governed from New York and Philadelphia. His executive mansion was a rented home, outfitted with extra furniture and makeshift elegance. No resolute desk, no situation room. Just borrowed decor and revolutionary dust. It's a strange wrinkle in the mythology. The man who shaped the presidency never sat in its most famous chair, never gazed out at the South Lawn, never strolled past the Rose Garden. He built a capital, but ruled from a temporary outpost. His ghost, if it exists, doesn't haunt the White House. It lingers in Philadelphia, pacing a borrowed parlor, wondering how much nicer the real place might have been. And if Washington missed his White House, James Buchanan missed something else. The point of emotional regulation, or maybe just stationary. James Buchanan kept a journal of broken pens and their emotional context. James Buchanan didn't leave behind children. He didn't leave behind many fans. But he did leave behind one of the strangest diaries ever kept by a president. A pen journal. He recorded every time a pen broke during his writing sessions. Each snap, each splatter, each inky betrayal, all logged. But not just the date or time, the mood. Snapped whilst agitated over cabinet insubordination. Nib bent during letter to Polk. Regret followed. Exploded ink bladder. Emotional recoil swift. He gave each pen a mini eulogy. Described their deaths like battlefield losses. Some pens got multiple paragraphs, some got named. One was called Iron Nib, another Faithful Scrivener. Why? Maybe because Buchanan, a bachelor president surrounded by swirling national collapse, needed something to control. Or maybe he projected his entire psyche into the objects of his profession. Each broken pen a symbol of frustration, powerlessness, suppressed rage. And let's be honest, it's weirdly relatable. Who hasn't stared at a snapped Bic and cursed the gods? But for Buchanan, it wasn't a moment. It was a chronicle, a saga, an emotional map of a man trying, and mostly failing, to manage a crumbling country through the psychodrama of shattered writing tools. Thomas Jefferson believed soaking feet in cold water daily prevented illness. Every morning, without fail, Thomas Jefferson began his day not with coffee or correspondence, but with a ritual that sounds more like a Spartan challenge than a presidential prep routine. He soaked his feet in ice-cold water, rain or shine, winter or summer. He'd sit, lower his bare feet into a basin of near-freezing water, and let the chill creep up his legs. Why? He swore it prevented illness, called it fortifying, said it strengthened the Constitution, by which he meant his own, not the one he helped draft. There's no medical basis for this, of course. Even by 18th century standards, it was a bit out there. But Jefferson was a man of enlightenment meets eccentricity. He believed in bodily discipline, scientific experimentation, and a bit of self-inflicted suffering to start the day right. It was all part of the image. The philosopher-president, master of Monticello, bathed in knowledge and cold water alike. While others took tea, Jefferson took a foot plunge, and he lived to 83. Coincidence? Maybe. But he likely would have said, no cold feet, no typhoid. If Jefferson began the day with frozen toes, Millard Fillmore went through life with even less emotional heat. Millard Fillmore never laughed aloud, only nose snorted. Millard Fillmore, 13th president, might have been the driest man to ever occupy the White House. He wasn't humorless, he just processed humor like a Victorian teapot, silently, with pressure building behind the scenes. He never laughed aloud, not once recorded. Not even a chuckle, a cackle, or a belly laugh. Instead, when amused, Fillmore would release a tight, almost imperceptible nose snort. A single sharp exhale. That was it. That was his laugh. Witnesses noted it. Diplomats grew confused. Comedians wilted mid-punchline. Jokes fell flat, only for Fillmore to blink, raise one eyebrow slightly, and offer a solitary HHANK from the nostrils. It wasn't arrogance, it was restraint. Fillmore believed unguarded laughter was undignified. Presidents, he claimed, shouldn't bark like hyenas at trifles. Which is also, ironically, hilarious. This trait made Fillmore hard to read. His approval, like everything about his presidency, was subtle, muted, almost mythologically reserved. It didn't help that his era was politically tense and culturally constipated. But there's something oddly comforting about a president who kept his glee under lock and key, an emotional minimalist in a job overflowing with drama. And while Fillmore kept his laughter inside, James Garfield looked outward, literally, to the cosmos. James Garfield carried a tiny telescope to stargaze randomly. James Garfield wasn't your average president. For one, he could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other at the same time. But even more charmingly bizarre, he carried a miniature telescope in his pocket, at all times. Why? Because you never know when you'll need to admire Saturn's rings or identify a rogue comet. Garfield was a stargazer in every sense. Raised in rural poverty, he looked to the sky not just for beauty, but for meaning. He studied astronomy, read scientific journals, and lectured on the stars before he ever ran for office. The telescope wasn't a gimmick. It was a tool for wonder. He'd pull it out at night on walks, during breaks between meetings, even during long train rides. He believed the stars reminded him of humility, that no matter how chaotic politics got, there was still order above. Imagine it, a president, wandering the White House grounds, squinting into a sky too vast to govern, too ancient to politicize. It was more than hobby. It was perspective. Garfield didn't get to finish his stargazing presidency. He was assassinated just months in. But in his brief time, he left behind a legacy of cosmic curiosity. Andrew Jackson used to carve insults into trees to annoy his neighbor. Andrew Jackson didn't believe in subtlety. He believed in muskets, duels, grudges, and long, loud vendettas. So when he had a problem with his neighbor, which of course he didn't settle it with a conversation or a politely worded note. He carved insults into the man's trees, repeatedly. Jackson had a long-standing feud with a local landowner in Tennessee. The cause? Landlines, grazing rights, and mutual loathing. Instead of taking the matter to court, or, keeping to his own property, Jackson picked up a knife and began writing. He'd wander near the disputed boundary, pick a tree, and carve something spiteful into its bark. Not elegant prose, not legal argument, just pure Jacksonian bile. The early 1800s version of a flaming tweet thread, only carved in oak, and he didn't stop with one tree. He created a forest of passive aggression, slurs, taunts, jabs about lineage, politics, and personal hygiene. One tree allegedly read, "Here lies a coward, too scared for truth, too loud for God." Every walk became a warpath, every oak a billboard. And when the neighbor tried to erase them, Jackson returned and etched them deeper. Repetition as punishment, persistence as principle. This was who Jackson was, the kind of man who carried bullets in his body from duels, spit tobacco like punctuation, and weaponized trees in property disputes. He didn't just win arguments, he engraved them. The local legend grew. Children whispered about the cursed trees. Guests at Jackson's estate, the Hermitage, sometimes stumbled upon the insults and thought they were cryptic religious warnings. They weren't. They were just Andrew Jackson being Andrew Jackson. And if carving his rage into wood sounds extreme, remember, this is the man who once beat a would-be assassin with his cane until his aides dragged him off.